Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Week 4 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. LPL is still pretty wild, basically every single week here. We have so many games, so many teams. It really does feel like there is a little bit of an upper and a lower half in the LPL at the current moment, but sometimes that can make for some of the most interesting series with upsets on the table at so many different opportunities, and so I'm really excited to get into Week 4 action. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What series were you most looking forward to? Did it live up to your expectations? What teams, in your opinion, are overperforming, underperforming? Would love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback about the LPL down in the comment section below, but without further ado, we've got a lot of games to cover, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you're new here, what we do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to create in all 7 days here in the LPL. We'll be giving a player of the series, a dud of the series, and at the end, I'll be updating my power rankings and giving a player of the week and a dud of the week as well. And so let's go ahead and jump right into day number 1, and we kick day 1 off with the matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and Team WE, and WE was able to take the 2-0 series win, bringing them to 4-0 in series score at the beginning of this split, 8-0 in game score. They have yet to drop even a single game up until this point. Just incredibly efficient stuff from WE. Now, yes, their schedule has been relatively easy, and obviously it is worth noting that they've played less games than everybody else in the league up until this point because they didn't play last week. They were completely absent in week number 3 because they were, representing Team China on the road to the Asian Games with a full Chinese lineup, and so they didn't exactly get a chance to play in week number 3. They're going to have a really stressful schedule towards the back half of this split, but going up against an NIP team that I think has shown at least a little bit over the beginning part of this split, maybe not a dominant team, but a team that at least more so than a lot of others look like a top 10 team at the current moment. WE made pretty quick work of them, exposing a lot of the weaknesses that team potentially still has. Player of the series for me is going to go to Hope in the bot lane. He was very consistent, especially in a lot of those team fights, and that's really where you're going to need him to step up. There were some question marks in the early game in game number 1, not just from him, but just in general for WE, but his ability to win games towards the back half was very impressive for them. Shanks was somebody who I've been really hyping up for WE for quite a while, not just, this split so far, but he had really been the guy in every single one of their series up until this point. So to see a lot of these resources and a lot of the pressure go down to the bot lane in this series, I think is a positive overall for WE, and Hope is a good player. He thoroughly outclassed Fodic in this series and was really, really fun to watch. I know a lot of people are now going to be hyping him up a ridiculous amount. Let's keep things in perspective. He's still the exact same player that we knew he was. We knew he could carry games. No one is saying that he's not talented. What people were saying was that he's not consistent, and that is absolutely still the case. That being said, really good series from him. Awanbi was also really good towards the back half of these team fights, especially in game number 1 on the Milio, where I don't think he's also going to get as much credit as he deserves. Really did like the outcome of what they were able to do in a lot of those team fights. It really was these two players stepping up for the most part. Hang pulled out the Nautilus jungle, and yes, lost a lot of pressure in the early game, as Nautilus jungle tends to do at the pro level. Still don't think it's a very good pick. I still think it's a little bit of a bait, but still was able to rebound, and that team fight can be really strong because you're basically just adding in another support. And then the Poppy, I think, was significantly more efficient in that game number 2 in general, and then Cube was kind of the target of a lot of what NIP wanted to do aggression-wise in the early game, and I think that's good for WE. That's why they brought someone like Cube on, is because he can take a lot of the aggression, he can take a lot of the pressure in the early game, and he can survive and still be very relevant in the late game. That's something that BBU just did not offer them. And it's funny, because the one player I really haven't brought up so far is Shanks, and he really has been like the MVP candidate for WE across the beginning part of this split, and so to see him just kind of be a guy on this team as everybody else just kind of makes a lot of room, I think it's very impressive stuff. Hopefully WE can keep it up. This is probably, a strength of schedule-wise, their most important win to date. And then for NIP, unfortunate loss, but it is to a good team here, and so they continue kind of their run as the gatekeepers of the LPL, the team that will consistently beat all of the teams in the bottom, 6 or 7, and then lose to all the teams that are in the top 9. That's kind of where they've just landed, I would say, in terms of skill. Not an awful place to be because it could land you in the playoffs, but certainly something to keep in mind. My dud of the series is going to go to Fodic, and again, I don't really hate Fodic. I feel like I'm being very harsh on Fodic this split, and honestly, in terms of dud of the series, I absolutely am. He is by far leading everybody in the LPL in dud of the series across the beginning of the summer split, and that just goes to show you that he's really just not in the best form, in my opinion. Really has not consistently been able to do anything with any sort of gold lead that he's been able to generate. It's not that he's even been that bad at generating those gold leads. It's just that he's really been inefficient at using them for anything other than just kind of slowly scaling out the game. When this team has won a lot over the course of this split, it's Shadow playing really well in the jungle, and I still think he's their best player, tied for their best player, I would say, with Angel, who I think has also been really good. It's been that jungle mid duo stepping up and really being a big positive for them overall, but the bot lane has been the up and down, inconsistent kind of part of this team, and I think that's going to be an issue for them moving forward. It seems that Photic and Juo are going to be fine against teams that don't necessarily need them to step up in the late game and be super big, threats, especially on things like Lucian and Xayah and things like that, but, going into Hope and Awandi, who are more than capable of being able to win games if you give them resources, like Photic and Juo just weren't able to hold up. Like, the laning phase was fine, but Photic's team fighting was really, really bad, and it just goes to show you that, I hate to say it, a lot of my analysis on Photic from last year holds up incredibly well. Like, he is the exact same player I was telling everybody that he was last year, and it wasn't particularly good in this series. It wasn't just him, but like I said, Juo wasn't very good either in either game, and then Invincible was just kind of a squishy top side, didn't really get to do all that much. The Gragas was the quote-unquote tank in that game number 2, and he was dying in literally 1.5 seconds. I think even the commentators ended up calling it out. So even if Angel in game number 1 was able to make a lot of plays, and Shadow, I think, had some nice pathing in both games, I think that NIP really just didn't have the firepower to be able to keep up here, and WE is a really good team, and so they shouldn't feel too bad for losing this one, but WE continues their undefeated streak, 8-0 to start the year. Their big test is coming up later in the week, so we're definitely going to see that, but at least from what we've seen from them so far, they've basically done everything they're supposed to. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 1, and it's a battle between maybe the two worst teams in the LPL at the moment. We had Anyone's Legend taking on LGD Gaming, and LGD finally gets to pick up their first series win of the year, of the split, I should say. Finally, some vengeance for this team that honestly really hasn't looked as bad as their record would indicate across the beginning part of this split. I do think that they are bad. I know there are a lot of people on Reddit that are like, oh, this team is way better than 0-7. They're better than even like the bottom 4 teams in the league, and I say, probably not. I wouldn't imagine that to be the case, if I'm being entirely honest. I think that good teams would have won 2 games out of 3 at least once, but unfortunately, a lot of teams in the LPL are bad, so maybe that is kind of the case right now, but good for LGD. The fact that it was a 2-0 win, I think, is honestly surprising to me, and in a good way. I think it's really, really positive for them overall. Player of the series was kind of difficult, because I think that there were a lot of players who played well in this series in particular, but I'm going to give it to Envy, the AD carry for LGD. They really need him to step up. He was their big mid-split acquisition, or mid-season, I should say, acquisition into summer here. Losing Xiaoshu in the top lane was a really big deal for this team. He was kind of the big focal point carry that they wanted to play through a lot in the spring split, and so him going to Rare Adam, I think, was definitely a little bit of a problem for them, and they needed somebody to be able to step up and take those resources, and Envy was supposed to be that guy, and he wasn't really that guy for the beginning part of the split. Honestly, I've been very critical of how he's played, especially when he's been reinserted into the lineup here, but he was good in this series. He was given resources, especially in that game 1 on the Xayah, where he was really good in lane, able to translate it into a really nice victory and make it relatively easy to win for LGD, but even in game 2, I thought he capitalized on a lot of Meteors and Gages, who definitely was a big standout player really, really well. So Envy playing well, Jin Zhao in that same way, I think playing well, easily his best series of the split so far. He's not been particularly good in summer. Not that that really surprises anybody, but he's been fine as a starter, I guess, in the LPL over the past year or so. Not somebody who I think has been so disastrous that you can't win any games with him. Just certainly not someone that I think is not upgradable, right? But he's kind of been worse than that, I would say, in summer so far. So good to see him and Envy actually have a good series for, I honestly want to say, for once here. And then Meteor just continues to be elo held. That's kind of the case for both junglers in this series, if I'm being entirely honest. Both are very good players that just aren't on very good teams, but Meteor finally being able to get his team to a win, a very good game 2 on the Vi, very well-deserved player of the game there, but he was good in game 1 as well, just a little bit more exploitable in terms of the team fight ranks, but I think Meteor is still a solid player. It's good to see him have 2 good games, not only in general, but on Vi in particular. I had been personally really critical of him because, he's really good on Kindred, and he's really good on Graves, and he's really good on these aggressive, marksman-oriented junglers, but how is he going to fare on the engagers, the things that really are meta right now? He hadn't necessarily looked nearly as good on those picks, and so to see him have 2 good games in a row on Vi, I think is definitely a positive overall. But Meteor, Envy, definitely the stand-up members. Even Jin Zhao, I think, was fine. Decade certainly had his best series as a pro up until this point. Hai Chao was fine in the mid lane, was a little bit of a problem in some of these games, was just a little bit over-aggressive, but it never really ended up being any sort of major issue for the team, just giving over some resources to AL, and so like what we saw from LGD, and congrats on their first win of the split. And then for AL on the other side, they're bad. They're probably the worst team in the LPL at the current moment, which, again, isn't particularly surprising. They looked pretty similar in spring, and their changes weren't exactly the most eye-popping ones. Pins is now out for Harder, it seems officially, and that's not necessarily worked out. Harder's going to get my dud of the series here. It looked like he was legit win trading in game number 2. Like, that was just some atrocious Gragas play. Obviously, he wasn't, because if he was, he would have made it less obvious than this. But, I mean, truly horrendous stuff coming out from him at the end of game number 2 on the Gragas, really just non-existent. And then Iboy and Zora really have just been whatever. I actually like Zora, at least a little bit. I think he can be an LPL support. Hasn't necessarily shown it on this team, but he also hasn't had very consistent AD carry play, and they can't really figure out which one they want to play there. Iboy was in this series, and he was whatever, got outplayed by Envy pretty considerably. I'm very low on Iboy, and so Ji Choi-yi, their other AD carry, is the player that I honestly would rather see in this spot at this point. I think he gives you more upside, and he's actually shown some interesting things mechanically speaking, but whatever, if you want to play Iboy in matchups that you think you can win and have him lose in lane early anyways, like, that's fine. Iboy's just not a very good player anymore. Xiao Hao is a good player, and I feel really bad that he's stuck on this team. Really good games on both Wukong and Kha'Zix, just no pressure coming from any of his lanes, so there's only so much he can do. And then ZDZ is fine in the top lane. He's continuing to be the exact same player we know him as, a mid to lower, a lower mid-tier top laner in the LPL. A starting caliber top laner, but not anybody that's going to completely blow you away, just in general an alright player. But AL just has nobody that is explosive enough to be able to win them games automatically. Like, Xiao Hao can be that, but not if every single one of his lanes is losing as hard as it did in the series. ZZZ is fine, and I think the bot side of their map is by far the worst in the LPL, and so, a lot of negatives coming out from AL, and I think this is really going to be a big case to drop them down to number 17, but good win for LGD. Getting on the board is really nice. No team is going to go winless in summer this split. Every single team now has at least one series win, and I think they're going to be happy about that, but I certainly don't see the same kind of upside for this team moving forward as maybe some other people do. And then moving on to day number 2 now, and we kick day 2 off with a battle between two teams that are kind of right outside playoff contention, as weird as that is. We had Ultra Prime taking on Rare Atom, and Ultra Prime does pick up the series win here with a 2-1. Nice stuff coming out from them. That actually puts them above 500, which I know is pretty insane, not in terms of actual game score, but in terms of series score. They're now at 4-3, even though they are 8-9, and so good stuff for Ultra Prime. I think a lot of people, me included, saw them as not very good going into the split. I had them at number 17 in my pre-split power rankings, and obviously that's been a little bit of a curse spot for me in particular, a positive spot for whatever team I end up putting in there. They almost never end up being bad. It was weird. Obviously in spring we had Invictus in that spot, and now we have Ultra Prime kind of overperforming expectations, but I think they're going to fall into a very similar kind of trap that Invictus did, where they're good against the teams that aren't very good, which right now in the LPL is a lot of teams, and then really just aren't the same level as the teams that are above them in terms of skill level. But good for Ultra Prime in terms of this series. My player of the series is going to go to Ning in the jungle. Now, I know people are pretty critical of Ning, especially recently, his over-aggressive plays, his inability to stay consistent really at all, but he's really been either the positive or the negative for Ultra Prime over the course of this year. Pretty much every game has either been won or lost by him in the jungle, and I think that certainly is something worth noting because this team is above 500. He's gotten almost every single player of the series and almost every single dud of the series that this team has had, which is impressive. Ning being such a big part of their game plan, I think it definitely shows in terms of when you watch the games, even if it doesn't necessarily show up in terms of score. He's definitely the focal point of what this team really wants to do as consistently as they do it. But he was good in this series, really good in both games 1 and 3, their wins. I think his tempo in the early game really allowed them to be able to set the pace both on the Vi and on the Sejuani, both champions that I think really can generate large leads in the early game, especially if you just outpath your opposing jungler. Vi in particular very much needs it going into something like Nocturne, definitely doesn't want to be on the other end of a Nocturne full engaging onto her backline with her not really having anything to do other than try her best to peel, and so good for Ning to be able to get the lead in game number 1, and then obviously the Sedge, pretty important to be able to generate a lead on in game 3 as well. Wasn't great on the Maokai in game 2, but honestly for Ultra Prime, like just talking about game 2 in general that they ended up not taking, they went back to the kinds of comps that I was really critical for them, kind of building towards in previous weeks, and these are the late game scaling, no real early game option type of comps. It's just not what Ultra Prime wants to do. Ning does not want to sit around and wait to scale. The rest of this team does not want to sit around and wait to scale, and when you draft Sion, Maokai, Azir, Aphelios, like, you're going to sit around and wait to scale. That's the game plan, and so when the enemy team drafts drafted Renekton, Nidalee, Jace. Like, they had no pressure in the early game, and they ended up just losing because it really isn't their style. It's not how they like to play the game. I think when they figured that out, they go back to things like the Zyrakan in Game 3, the Annie that gives them a little bit more prio. I think that Ultra Prime definitely is more successful on comps like that, and I think we definitely saw that, but this is a relatively decent team. Doggo had another really good series. He's really underrated. I'm going to say it. There are a lot of AD carries that I think get a lot of hype over Doggo that I just don't deserve it. I don't think are in that same category. I think, you know, we're getting to a point where we just talked about him, a player like Fodic on NIP. Like, would I take him over Doggo? I really don't know, right? Doggo's a really good player that if you give him resources will step up and actively make your team look better, especially in the mid game where I think he really excels. I understand that consistency can be a problem for him, but his highs are very scary, and he's more consistent than people give him credit for, especially when the rest of the team is playing well. And so, good for him. People love Harry in the top lane for Ultra Prime. I'm still not on board in terms of him being like a superstar top laner in this league, but he's a decent player. He's a really good team fighter. He's just a really bad laner, and that can be a little bit of a problem in the LPL. We saw what someone like Rich's ceiling was in terms of what he was able to offer in the LPL. You know, obviously, he's a good player. I'm not trying to say that Rich is a bad player, but that seems like the type of archetype that Harry ends up fitting into, and so not exactly like superstar upside for me, just somebody who I think you can win with on the top side of the map. But overall, Ultra Prime is certainly better than I expected them to be, and I don't even think that's really a competition. And then for Rare Atom on the other side, would have liked to see them win this series, if I'm being entirely honest. I don't think that there are a lot of teams outside of the top 10 right now that feel all that competitive, and Rare Atom was one of the ones that I really wanted to see step up. There's a lot of talent on this team that I like. Xiaoshu and Strive can be one of the scarier solo lane duos in the entire league, especially towards the bottom of the standings, but they haven't necessarily, you know, stepped up this split in the same way that I think they can. And then Leon is just way too inconsistent in the jungle. He was really good in Game 2 on the Nidalee, being able to create so much in the early game for a team that was like betting everything on the early game, but you watch Game 1, you watch Game 3, and he's just getting out-jungled consistently, and so that's the problem, is I'm really just out on Leon, and I think it's going to hold this team back a considerable amount. He's just never going to be consistent enough for them to be able to win games. Really, I thought he was going to do well into a matchup like this, you know, a volatile jungler like Ning. That's where Leon usually is able to generate his leads, but not so much in this series. Assume and Feather down in the bot lane were not good. Feather's going to get my dud of the series for Rare Atom. Really hard to look good when your entire team is inting and you're playing Nautilus, but still, you got to know when to go in and when not to go in, and Feather just never got the memo. And so a couple of really bad games coming out from him. Assume not necessarily dragging his team into the right direction either. It just felt like this team was very not cohesive. It didn't feel like they had a lot going for them in terms of synergy, and that's always going to be at least a little bit of a worry. So Rare Atom, you know, dropping now down to 2-5, like, they're still going to be one of the more competitive teams in the bottom 6 or 7, and that's only because the bottom 6 or 7 are all really bad, but Ultra Prime clearly proving in this series that maybe they deserve more credit than being lumped in with the rest of those teams, and, you know, obviously their schedule's been relatively easy, but hopefully they're going to be able to keep it up. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it's another battle between two teams that really aren't doing all that well in the standings right now. We had FunPlus Phoenix taking on Invictus Gaming, and FPX does pick up the 2-0 series win. I'm not really sure what is going on with this IG team. A lot of their players are back. Had a couple of players be out, well, I guess one really, for the road to the Asian Games. You should know me in the top lane, and then they are now officially pulling the trigger on not playing in this series. Xiao Yueji came in, and, you know, we'll talk about that when we get to the IG section, but FPX was the better team in this series, and it was by a considerable margin. I know that Game 2 was pretty back and forth, and there were moments where it looked like IG, you know, had something to be able to go off of, but FPX was honestly better throughout the majority of the series, especially in that game number 1, where it felt like IG just had absolutely no pressure on the map at all. Player of the series for me, and longtime fans of the channel are going to be surprised to hear this, is going to go to Xiao Laohu in the top lane, someone who I've been extremely critical of over his time in the LPL. I've, you know, multiple times said that we have seen everything that we're going to see out of Xiao Laohu, and I think everything we've seen has shown that he's not an LPL caliber top laner. Those are the things that I've said about him in the past, but this might be the single best series that he's played as a member of FPX across the 4 years that he's been given chances or whatever in the LPL. He was just pretty solid, very consistent. That game number 2 on the Gragas was actually really good. A lot of those engages were fantastic, and the disengages as well. His ability to make sure that the Fed members of Invictus couldn't get onto his backline were also incredibly important. I honestly think he just played the game well, and, you know, I'm not going to take that away from him. This was a really good performance and something that I'm really happy to see. I don't exactly exactly expect him to be able to keep it up over the course of an entire split or anything like that, but nice to see that he was able to kind of show up and deliver a good series. Hacker continues to stay in here as the starting jungler for FPX, and he's fine. Honestly, like, I would consider him the worst jungler in the league, but maybe not right now with Beishong in there. These are probably the two worst junglers in the LPL at the current moment, and Hacker making the case to not be number 17, so good for him. He was definitely the better jungler in game 1. He didn't really do anything in game 2 on the Sejuani, but at the very least, he was aggressive in game number 1, able to generate leads for his team and set the tempo across the map. That's really what you want to see out of a jungler who, in the past, has kind of gotten in trouble for not really doing a whole ton, so good stuff from him. Kair looked really good on the Annie, looked significantly less good on the Yone, but still, I think, Kair is a player that I like moving into the future. I'm not as sold on him as I was at the beginning of the split. It really does feel like either his mental is just destroyed or a lot of his mechanics have regressed a considerable amount this split. There have been a lot of mistakes that I just don't think he was making a lot over the course of his career up until this point, but still, I think there's definitely something in there, and that Annie game in game number 1 was definitely showing that, and then LWX and Chocho were good, especially towards the back half of games. They know how to team fight. They know what they need to do. They're not exceptional in terms of what they're able to do themselves, but they're not the worst either. And so for FPX, I think they're going to be fine. I'm still not sold on this team by any means because it really didn't feel like they played all that well across this series, if I'm being entirely honest, but they grabbed the 2-0 win, and that's what matters. But if FPX didn't play well, then what the hell did Invictus do? Well, they played even worse. That was kind of the big problem here. One real sub in here. You Should Know Me returning from the Road to Asian Games. He represented Team Hong Kong, and so he's back in the top lane. I think that's a positive overall. We'll talk about that. He was at least some level of explosiveness from this team that they had severely lacked over the last few games. And then, like I said, Xiao Yueji is back in the AD carry spot. He hadn't been playing at the LPL level in a while. It's been over a year, I want to say. Obviously, I've talked about him on this channel before, but he's been absolutely crushing the LDL. I've talked about that in the past. The dude is just way too good for the LDL, but he's never really been surrounded by good enough talent to make it work at the LPL level. He's given an opportunity here, but the unfortunate thing is it really does feel like the two most interesting players in Invictus Gaming's organization at the current moment are both AD carries with On and Xiao Yueji, who I think both are really solid players, and On getting benched here I think is definitely frustrating as somebody who likes him as a player, but Xiao Yueji is a good player, so I understand it. The problem is that there's no one else on Invictus Gaming that can step up. This jungle position has been an absolute disaster for them over the course of this split, whether it was Tianjin at the beginning of the year, who was the worst jungler before he got replaced. Do not get it twisted, he was not good, or Beishong now, who has very quickly become the worst jungler ever since he got this spot. It just doesn't feel like anybody in that jungle position for IG has been successful. Even Gideon in spring really wasn't making all that much of a mark, especially towards the back half of the split. Beishong is going to get my dud of the series. He's gotten almost all of them ever since he started here for Invictus Gaming. He's just not very good right now. I don't know if it's a form thing. I don't know if that's something that he just needs time to mesh with the team with, but spoiler alert, he's not going to get that time. I don't know. It just isn't working. He hasn't played in quite a long time, and the last time he did play, he also wasn't in fantastic form. He's been really, really good at the LPL level in the past for WE, but clearly that version of him is just not there anymore, so got to be relatively frustrating. You Should Know Me and Xiao Yueji were relatively good here. I want to see Cryan step back up. He was really good in week 1 for this team, and it feels like he has completely fallen off of a cliff, and so I don't really know how to judge this team. It doesn't feel like they're very good, but it honestly doesn't feel like either of these teams are very good. Congratulations to FPX for being able to walk out of this with a win, but I certainly don't feel enough confidence in either of these two to say that they're anything above some of the bottom teams in the league. And then moving on to day number 3 here, and we kick day 3 off with the matchup that I think we really wanted to see one team perform well in to get back on track. We had Edward Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and EDG does get the job done, and they take the 2-0 series win. Really important win for them here. If they weren't able to pick this up in relatively dominant fashion, I would have been quite concerned. This team just really has kind of been sputtering ever since the split started, which is really not what you would have expected from a team that pretty clearly looked like a top 2, maybe at worst top 3 team in spring split. And so really good stuff coming out from EDG, at least in this one. Really happy to see them, kind of start to get a little bit more cohesive now. Cohesion is definitely something I'm worried about for them going up against some top teams, and I'll explain why when we talk about them a bit more. But first, we have to talk about my player of the series, and that is going to go to Fofo in the mid lane. I've been seeing so much Fofo slander on the timeline, and trust me, I'm all for Fofo slander, off the Rift or whatever you want to say, but on the Rift, I just think it's a pretty absurd statement to make. I've been seeing so many people say that he's not good enough to be playing for this team, that his form last year was indicative of his form this year, and to that, I say, first of all, I want to say, I understand that not everybody gets a chance to watch every game. Like, I'm a little bit different. I watch every single LPL game. I get to see these players in and out, and over the course of an entire split, I get to kind of judge their entire catalog, and I know not everybody is going to do that. In fact, most are just not, but to say, first of all, that Fofo has not been good this year is just an absurd thing to say, in my opinion. Fofo has been pretty fantastic for EDG, was an all-pro caliber mid laner in spring, in my opinion, and was a really big part of why that team was so successful. I think you could argue that him and Jeje were the bigger part of that team as opposed to Leave and Mako. I know a lot of people like to say that bot lane was a big deal in spring. I thought jungle mid was more important. And second off, that he can only play control mages when he was like the Jace guy last split. He was absolutely destroying people on Jace. He was really good on Cassante when he pulled it out. Just a really versatile player. I think that Fofo honestly gets a bad rap on the Rift, I guess you could say. Obviously, you know, you can have problems with him off the Rift or whatever, but I think on the Rift there are some I think any of the concerns that people have about him are just kind of not there for me, and I think he's been really good over the course of this split. He was really good in this series. Obviously, going up against Pins, not exactly the toughest competition in the mid lane, but still, I think he performed really well, especially on that Victor in Game 2. Uzi was also really good. I do want to say I am a little concerned about this bot lane because not to go too deep into the communication rabbit hole, but we saw the mic check for EDG, and Uzi is ridiculously vocal for this team. He always has been. He was very vocal for RNG, you know, over the course of his career. That was kind of a big staple for him, but Mako is also somebody who's notoriously been very vocal, and I think, especially when you watch some of those mic check videos, you can tell in teamfights Mako wants to talk, Mako wants to shot call, and Uzi's just kind of doing it all, so some of the miscommunications that I think come towards the back half of the game, which, by the way, definitely still existed in this series, I think definitely need to be ironed out, but Uzi mechanically is still really freaking good, and his early laning phases have been terrific on the Lucian and on, you know, similar picks, the Xayah as well, and so I like what this team is doing. I like how they're constructed at the current moment. Ale, JJ, Mako, they're all solid players, but it really is going to be up to whether Uzi can fit in with the rest of this team, whether he can become a really good team fighter for them, because so far, honestly, he's just kind of been meh towards the back half of games, or if Fofo can step up and be a primary carry for this team and really be someone that takes over the game on things like Azir, on things like Victor, high resource mages in the mid lane. And so, going to be interesting to see which direction they go, but this was a pretty good showing for them, I would say, overall. And then for AL on the other side, they're just not very good. There really isn't a lot to say. They're flipping back and forth in their carry roles. Pins is back in for Harder, who was miserable at the start of the week, and Ji Choi Yi is back in for iBoy. I like that move. I actually like both of these moves. I think this is their their highest upside 5, I would say. Maybe not their best 5, that's what I was going to say, but, you know, you can make an argument that, you know, this isn't the best right now, but to me, this is pretty clearly the starting 5 that gives you the most upside moving forward, and so I'd like to see it for the rest of the split for a team that is just not very good at the current moment, but it continues to be Xiao Hao and then a bunch of wards. Like, really, that is what AL is. Xiao Hao is so ridiculously elo held on this team. He was awesome, again, in this series. There were multiple moments where I think you could make the argument that he was a better jungler than Jeje in this series, and I think that's obviously an incredibly impressive thing to say, and I think it should go to Xiao Hao. I know there's no bigger Xiao Hao fan in the world than me, probably certainly no one who's been a fan as long as I have, and so I'm certainly someone that I think maybe gets a little bit of a pass on being on the Xiao Hao hype train, but he continues to be really good for this team, and if he played for a top 5 or 6 team in the league, I think he would look right at home. But the rest of this team is just not very good. Pins got outplayed in the mid lane by Fofo, especially in that game 2 on the Nico. Ji Choi Yi and Zora were okay. He's certainly better, Ji Choi Yi is, than iBoy, in my opinion. That's probably the biggest upgrade this team can actively make at the current moment, is just keeping him in. I don't think iBoy is a very good player, and at least Ji Choi Yi is an okay team fighter. Like, that is something that he has shown to be able to do at a relatively decent level. Uzi really outplayed him in laning phase, but I think you can make an argument that Ji Choi Yi was actually the better AD carry in team fights, at least, you know, comparatively to where the gold situation was, so that's something to keep in mind. But ZDZ is going to get my dud of the series in the top lane, was just miserable, especially on that Renekton. He can be more hit and miss than I think people give him credit for. I've definitely started to kind of jump off of the bandwagon for ZDZ. At the beginning of the year, I was saying that he could be like a starting caliber top laner for a decent team, you know, similar to someone like Cube. I don't think that anymore. I think he's probably like a lower mid top laner, somebody who, you know, is fine. He's certainly not the worst top laner in the entire league and can have good games and, you know, is going to be fine in a lot of matchups, but can also lose pretty hard to especially the best top laners in the league, like Ale is, and that was kind of the case in this series. So he's going to get done of the series, but overall, AL's just not very good. They dropped to 1-7, and honestly, I don't think a lot of people are surprised to see them struggling so much. Poor Xiao Hao, though. And then for EDG, it's a nice win, but it's against AL. We need to see this team generate some consistency against teams that they should actually be beating. They've fallen all the way down to number 7 in my power power rankings, and honestly, like, that's being generous with how they performed up until this point this split. And so while this is a very good win, it needs to stay consistent, and we need to see these performances more often before I feel really confident in these players. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's another matchup that should be more interesting than I think it ended up being. We had Weibo Gaming taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and Weibo does get the job done. They're able to pick up the 2-0 series win in relatively clean fashion, although ThunderTalk did show at least some ability to fight in some of these games, and it's some of the players that I think we really wanted to see it out of the most, but Weibo is just the better team, and ThunderTalk is in complete free-fall mode right now. I'm not really breaking any ground by saying either of those things. Weibo is a team that is going to be competing to go to the World Championships as long as they stay even remotely consistent, and ThunderTalk has just completely fallen off of a cliff, starting 1-7 this split after making playoffs for the first time ever last split. And so, you know, seeing Weibo be able to come out of this with the 2-0 win, it's not particularly surprising. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Light in the bot lane. He has been one of the best players in the league this split. I know he's not going to get the same kind of recognition that Jackie Love or some of the other, you know, really Ruler, you know, some of the other highly touted AD carries at this level will get, but Light has been just as good and just as consistent as any of them. He's had a couple of up and down games here and there. I would say hasn't exactly been like the pinnacle of perfection that maybe some of the other AD carries have, but honestly, I really don't think anybody other than Jackie Love has been like perfect over the course of this split up until this point, and so Light really stepping up and being somebody that this team can play through, I think has been really impressive, and it just continues to add on to his resume of being the guy on a team of really talented individual players that steps up and makes the team work and wins the team fights in the late game. And so really good for Light. He's going to get player of the series. Really like him on Aphelios, but we know he can play those more early game style of champions as well. It's just not really the style that Weibo wants him to go. They've got a lot of players that are going to take a lot of risks in the early to mid game. Xiaohu obviously comes to mind in that respect, but even Weiwei I think is definitely more of a mid game kind of jungler, and the Shy is definitely someone who is going to be a little bit hit or miss just in general game to game, and so you want that team fight consistency coming out of your bot lane. So Light's kind of been relegated to hyper carry duty, trying to play these Aphelios is good thing. He plays them at a super high level, and he looks really good doing it. Really like Light, and I think he's going to be a very sneaky candidate to be MVP again, like he's been basically every split of his entire career, where people just aren't talking about him, and then when they look back at the split as a whole, they're like, oh my god, like this guy has won so many games for his team. But Chris was really good as well, especially on the Rakan in game number 1. Really liked what we saw from him, but game number 1 really was defined by Xiaohu on the LeBlanc. A really good game from him. Just a little bit of inconsistency. Would have liked to see him push his lead a little bit more in game 2 on the Annie, but if we're just going based off of game number 1, that LeBlanc was still incredibly impressive, and I think when you're looking at the grand scheme of things, you could make the argument that Xiaohu was the most important member towards Weibo in this series. I think, for me, Light's consistency towards the back half of the game was winning that game number 2 for them, but Xiaohu, I think, was also really, really good. Another player that I really like, and that I don't think gets nearly enough credit. Weiwei was very consistent, definitely the better jungler in this series. We've talked about some jungle black holes in terms of teams. That definitely applies to ThunderTalk as well, at least at the current moment, and so, you know, Weiwei coming in and looking good, I think, is a positive. And then the Shy was the Shy. He actually didn't lose super hard. Hoya actually had a good series, I would say, overall in the Cassante. Definitely made some nice plays both early and late game, but the Shy wasn't a problem. And that's really all this Weibo team needs him to be. He doesn't need to be a superstar for them. They've got Xiaohu and they've got Light, both of whom can win games for this team. As long as the Shy isn't an issue, I think they're going to be fine. Weibo was good in this series, and I think that that is a positive. But man, ThunderTalk is just not a good League of Legends team, and it's very disappointing to see. Beixuan was back into the jungle here. Zhao Huangren was benched. I don't really care what this team ends up doing. I'm going to be entirely honest with you. I just want them to figure it out, because I think switching back and forth in terms of the roster that they have here is just making all of these players play significantly worse in an environment that is already, you know, reportedly very bad. And so I don't really know what's going on. Beixuan was back in. He wasn't very good in this series. I don't blame him particularly. He was put on tank duty and he was getting out jungled, and, you know, he's probably not practicing all that much because they want to spend time on Zhao Huangren, or maybe Zhao Huangren's not practicing all that much. I don't really know what's going on. 1xN and Yao Yao were still in the bot lane, and these two have like no chemistry together. Like, yes, maybe they're good individual players, but Yao Yao, I think, is mentally completely burnt out. He's going to get my dud of the series here. I think you could give it realistically to either jungle or support here for ThunderTalk. I gave it to support because if I can't remember a good play that they made. At least for Beixuan, he was trying to create in a lot of these situations. He was trying to do something, it just wasn't working out. For Yao Yao, I just can't remember a single engage from the Blitzcrank or the Nautilus that actually was a positive for the side of ThunderTalk, and Yao Yao's actually been like horrendously bad this split so far. far. I really like him as a player. I think he can be a really solid support, but clearly his mental is just completely and utterly obliterated on this team. I don't really know what the fix is. I think at this point, maybe you do just have to bench him, but Uyanja is arguably worse, and so ThunderTalk has accidentally put themselves in a situation where they've ruined the mental of their only good support on roster. 1xN seems fine. I hear a lot of really, really high things about him, and people are like, yeah, have you seen the positioning in these team fights? It's very similar to what people were saying about Assume last year, where it's like, look at this bad team, but this player looks okay on it, and I'm like, yeah, he looks okay, but he needs to show a lot more if I want to agree with you that he's got some, like, top 5, top 7 ADC in the region upside. I just have not seen that yet, and especially when you do have an arguably top 5, top 7 ADC on roster right now in Huanfeng, like, it's just very bizarre to me that 1xN is getting the playing time. Even if you do see upside in him, I certainly would expect him to not be as good as Huanfeng right now, and so very weird. Yucal is fine, made some pretty critical mistakes in game 2 on the Azir, but still was relatively okay, and then Hoya actually had a relatively good series, I would say, overall for ThunderTalk, but this team's mental is just destroyed. They really don't have a lot going for them at the current moment, and it's very clear when you watch this team that the communication and the mental is just not there. And then for Weibo, like I said, you're looking good. You just got to be able to keep it consistent. You've beaten some of the best teams in the league. Really good to see you beating some of the worst teams in the league as well. If they continue to be a team that can win pretty much every series, they're going to skyrocket up the standings because of how inconsistent the LPL can be, and really, like, especially if Light and Xiaohu can step up and be primary carries, this could be one of the scariest teams in the world. And then moving on to our third series of day number 3 here, and it's another really intriguing one, a top-of-the-table clash between Bilibili Gaming and LNG Esports. Really looking forward to this one, but wasn't particularly close, as Bilibili is going to be able to take the 2-0 series win. Good stuff from them. It really does feel like their only kryptonite at this point is JD Gaming at the top of the standings, which I don't blame them, man. JDG's a pretty damn good team and very difficult to actually deal with, but BLG looks basically unstoppable going up against anybody else in the LPL at the current moment, and keeping them at number 2 at the end of last week I think was definitely the right call. This team continues to just kind of push forward and look pretty fantastic in basically every single lane. Early game, mid game, late game, it doesn't really matter. We used to talk about this team as somebody who really needed to generate a lot of early game leads, or else they weren't going to be able to keep up. Their mid and late games were certainly not as consistent as teams like EDG at the end of last split when we're talking about their playoff run, but they've really completed, I would say, a lot of growth over the course of the last few months, whether that was at MSI, whether that was before or after, whatever you want to say, right? This team has become one of the most consistent teams in the entire world, and certainly one of the most dangerous on a game-to-game basis because of just the pure talent level that you have to go into, and especially the style that they like to play with. Player of the series for me, very happy to say this is going to go to Bin in the top lane. Really happy to see Bin have a good series. He's honestly started by far the slowest, I would say, of anybody on BLG, at least in summer so far. Was fantastic at MSI, but Bin has been somebody who has coasted in the regular season before for teams, and so wasn't surprised to see him not necessarily take the reins, I would say, to start this series, but he was phenomenal in this particular series against LNG, going up against a player in Zika who I really like, who I think has taken quite a bit of growth and quite a step forward on LNG over the course of the last few months. I think Bin just made very quick work of him. I mean, 16-0-2, that really does tell the story, especially on that Jax in game number 1. The Renekton in game 2 was still fantastic. I think a lot of people are going to be looking at On's Blitzcrank in that second game, but really this series was about Bin. It was about him taking over the game. It was about him controlling the pace. Really impressive stuff coming out from the BLG top laner. If he's going to step up and continue to be arguably the best top laner in the LPL and maybe even the best top laner in the world, then this team is unstoppable because they've been able to beat basically everybody in the league without the best top laner in the world. So you add that on top, you have him winning in lane, you have him, moving into the mid game being one of the strongest, melee carries that you can possibly have in something like a Jax, and his team fighting is so fantastic that it really does become a massive problem for the other team to have to deal with, and that really creates a lot of opportunities for the team. And so really good on Bin. Like I said, On was also massive in this series. People are going to look at the Blitzcrank game, but the Rakan game in game number 1 was just as good in my opinion. On is continuing to show that he deserves to be in the best support in the world conversation, and I'm really happy to say that as somebody who's been a fan of him for so many years now and who's hyped him up on this channel for quite a long time. It's really cool to see him just support gap basically everybody in the region. Really, really happy. Obviously, every single time he gets this Blitz, he basically gets player of the game. It's about the most consistent thing that the LPL has at the current moment, is that on picks Blitzcrank, they win, and he gets player of the game. It just kind of is how it is, but, you know, there's a reason for that. It's because you can't really allow him to have this champion. He's super consistent at being able to find engage opportunities and to be able to set up the rest of his team with it, and really, I think it just creates opportunities for everybody to be able to generate gold. Yagao was good this game, although we'll get to Scout. Scout wasn't particularly great in game 1, but he was phenomenal in game number 2, or at least he tried to save the game in game number 2. Elk was fine, felt super bad for him in game 2, just consistently getting blown up by the LeBlanc, but that's 80 carry in 2023. And then Shun was good as well. I think, you know, you get his signature Nidalee in game number 2. Wasn't exactly the standout carry performance that maybe you were looking for when he gets his signature champion, but that's okay. I think the rest of the team definitely was good enough to be able to pick up for it. So BLG looking great, and especially this top lane looking fantastic. And then for LNG on the other side, I'm not going to say I'm worried about this team. Maybe they're not a top 4 team at the current moment, which would be incredibly disappointing with the amount of talent that they have. But man, the consistency that they don't have against the other top teams in the region is just a little bit astounding to me. I really like how they play against some of the worst teams in the region. Like, they look more dominant and more controlling, I would say, against, you know, bottom tier teams than maybe any other of the top tier teams, but they really have not consistently been able to beat any of the best teams in the region, and that includes a team like BLG, which is concerning. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Hang in the support position. I can understand why people might not look at him immediately and say that he was the problem, but I do think support gap in game 2 was a big reason why LNG had really no way to come back in that game. The Milio just was not working. I understand Gala on the Tristana definitely could have done more, and I agree with that. It could have been more coming out from him, but I thought he was actually relatively good in terms of game 1, and definitely he was dealing damage. Scout was keeping the game alive for that team, so it certainly wasn't going to be him. And I don't think Zeke or Tarzan lost hard enough for me to consider it, so Hang was definitely the one that ended up getting Dud of the series for that support gap. He really wasn't a massive problem. Really, the issues for LNG stem from the fact that this team is really just not consistent. They're not talented enough in lane to be able to consistently go up against the best teams, which is crazy to say because it's Tarzan, Scout, Gala. So, like, if they're not talented enough to be able to do it, who is? But it really does feel like their early laning phases have just not been able to be good enough against the best teams in the region. And so that is certainly something I'm going to keep in mind. Tarzan has not been an all-pro caliber jungler like he was last split. I don't know if that's a communication thing. I don't know if it's just a confidence thing. He's had rough regular seasons in the past. Look at 2022, but hopefully he's going to be able to turn it around because he's a big piece to this team. Gala has looked good, but very inconsistently good. Some games he looks great, and some games it just he's kind of there. He's not necessarily been a problem for this team, but I'd like to see a little bit more, and I still think Scout is a phenomenal player, and he's probably still the best player on LNG. It's just, again, you need to get more out of the rest of this team, and so you're really hoping that the star power helps elevate this LNG team, but right now they just feel like a very good team, maybe one right on the outside of being great. And then for BLG, I mean, they are great. They are a top 2 team in the region. Unfortunately, you know, JDG is still their kryptonite at the top of the standings, but number 2, I think, is a pretty good spot, and man, if this team continues to do what they've done all year, which is grow and get better, I mean, watch out for playoffs by the end of the split. And then moving on to day number 4 here in week number 4 of the LPL, and we kick day 4 off with a matchup between Invictus Gaming and Rare Adam. Now, Rare Adam is going to be able to take into games, continuing to prove that there really is like a top 2 in terms of the bottom, 6 or 7 teams in the league at the current moment. And Rare Adam, lucky for them, is in that top 2, which is crazy to say considering they're only 3 and 5, but that's more than enough to be able to separate yourself from some of the worst teams in the league right now, which definitely have shown themselves to be that. Invictus making some changes, Rare Adam making some changes in this series. Balan is in instead of Feather in the support position. Not necessarily sure this is an up or a downgrade. Was really good in this series. I would have probably told you this was a downgrade because I actually like Feather and what he's been able to show, but it looks like Balan and Assume actually have better chemistry as a duo, and so that was interesting. Again, it's against a bad team, so we'll need to see more. And obviously Balan against his former org is definitely a matchup that I think is fun to talk about. But IG subbing Tianjin back in. Beishong is not only benched, he is actually gone from the team, so they brought him in, tried him out for 3 series, and then let him go. Very weird stuff coming in from Invictus, not really giving him a lot of time to gel with the rest of this team, but whatever, they want to try out Tianjin again. We'll get to him, and then On is back in the starting lineup. Sure, whatever, right? Zhao Yueji was whatever in series number 1. I do think he's a good player, but On is also a really good player. And so whoever you want to end up going with there, I think it makes sense. But Rare Adam looking pretty solid. There are a lot of players that I think you can look at and point to as really good in this series for RA because it was pretty much just gapping every single lane. But player of the series for me is going to go to Assume in the bot lane. Really happy to say that this was easily the best series that he's played in a Rare Adam uniform. He was mediocre at best in spring. I think that I'm very much lower on him as a player than most of the community. You hear a lot of people talking about him as as another 80 carry with potential top, 7, 8, 9, 80 carry upside. There can only be so many ADCs that have that kind of upside. The community really likes to, overhype a lot of ADCs coming out of the LPL. For good reason, there's a good track record, but to me, Assume has just never been that guy that I really want to trust to get to that level. I think this was a sign that, like, oh, okay, you put talent around him and you kind of force feed him a lot of gold and he's going to be able to capitalize on it, but I need to see more consistency out of him. Either way, still a really good series from him, especially in that game 2 on the Aphelios. Really like what we saw out of him. Strive was also really good. Continue to like him as a player. Has definitely not been the takeover threat that he was in Spring Split. I was kind of looking at him as like a sneaky all-pro kind of guy towards the back half of Spring Split when he was just like on fire, like winning games by himself for Rare Atom on some of his more signature picks. He's kind of moved to a different playstyle, a much more secondary carry supportive playstyle, and it's good to see that he can do that well, but, hopefully get some opportunities to shine and be the big focal point for this team again, because I think he did that really well in the Spring Split. And then Xiaoshu is just really freaking talented. Really happy to see him be on a team that actually has talent around him. I know it's crazy to say that because Rare Atom's certainly not the pinnacle of consistency, but he's certainly on a better team than he was on in Spring with that LGD team. So I would say good overall for Rare Atom. Baolan looked like an upgrade to Feather, at least in this series, but again, going up against one of the most inconsistent teams in the league, his aggressive tendencies are definitely going to be a little bit less punishable, I would say, by them than they would be by better teams. So let's go ahead and see how that ends up playing out. If they put Feather back in for other series, I wouldn't be particularly surprised. And Leon was good too. Overall, I just like Rare Atom in this series. I like Rare Atom as a team. I think that they're pretty decent. Maybe not a playoff team at all, but really there aren't a lot of people that are going to be contending in that 11 to 12 spot, and I think they're definitely in that zone. And then for IG, I mean, they just can't catch a break. This jungle position is literally a black hole for them. Tianjin is my no-brainer choice for dead of the series. This Rengar game in game 2, I mean, I get it. It's his signature pick, but Rengar's not a very good champion, and if you're going to bring out your signature pick, you can't just, like, literally int on it. Like, you can't be the worst player that I've ever seen on it. You know what I mean? If you're going to pull something out that isn't meta, you have to make it work, and he did not make it work. I don't know if it's a confidence thing, but remember my analysis on him going into the split. I know that there are a lot of people on social media that will tell you that he looked really good in the LDL. I disagree. I don't think he looked particularly great in the LDL. He looked like a supportive jungler, somebody who just kind of allowed the rest of the team to carry games and wasn't really a big problem for that IG Young team, and that's kind of the concerns have kind of come true, that he's just not the kind of player that's going to be able to hold up at this level. I don't know what the solution is. They got rid of their other jungler, and they clearly want to just go with Tianjin, but I think it's going to hold them back from being anything other than one of the worst teams in the entire league to play him all split long. Cryan's fine. You Should Know Me is fine. On and Wink are whatever. Wink, I definitely think has taken a step back, but like this team is just not very good, and if their jungle is going to lose as hard as it has, basically no matter who is playing in it across the entire split, then they're not going to win games. That position is just too important right now, and it's too exploitable if you lose this as hard as he does for you to be able to win consistently. And so as much as I think there is talent on this IG team, they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league if they can't figure out what the hell is going on. And then for Rare Atom, it's a nice win to have here. Their players are talented. I don't exactly think that they're a playoff team. I don't think that they're going to be competing for the playoffs, but it's nice to see that they at least have the potential to win games in them, and I certainly think that a win like this does prove that they're probably above the bottom 4, bottom 5 teams in the league. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4 here, and it's a battle between two teams that I was really interested to see go head-to-head because of the storyline. We had Royal Never Give Up taking on Edward Gaming, and RNG does get the job done. They're able to take this series 2-0, by the way, and look pretty damn good doing so. It's Uzi facing RNG, always going to be a pretty hot topic in terms of interest, but this series really was not about Uzi. This was not the Uzi show, although he did look pretty good in game number 2 on that Zeri. This was RNG. This is RNG stepping up and proving that, you know what, we are better probably than number 9 in terms of the power rankings that I had been giving them. We're consistent. Maybe we're not the best team in the entire league. Maybe we still have some growing pains to go through with some of our young players, but our veterans are actually really freaking good at this game, and the young players are stepping up when they need to on the picks that can really make a difference. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me was actually kind of difficult because really the whole top side of this map for RNG was really good in this series, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Breathe in the top lane, who I just think has been crazily underrated to start this split. I understand Wei has been phenomenal for RNG, and he deserves a lot of credit for having a really good split. There are a lot of players on this team that aren't game to game very consistent, and Wei has actually been much better in my opinion than he was in spring with a lot of players that I think he really needed to step up and make sure we're in a good spot. But I think Breathe is just not getting nearly the kind of credit he deserves. I think you could make a really strong case that Breathe has been the best player on RNG so far in Summer Split. I think his consistency of being able to survive or win in the top lane, either go even or win in any matchup in the top lane, is super admirable. And man, he's just like the best team fighter in the region. Like, I know I'm not the most like, oh, you know, not great laner, good team fighter, like good top laner kind of guy, right? Rich, you know, even a player like Harry at a lesser level, I think kind of fall into those categories, and I'm much lower on them, I think, as overall players and their upside. But that's not what Breathe is. Breathe isn't somebody who's going to be bad in lane and good in team fights. He's somebody who's going to be good, if not, you know, really good in lane and great in team fights, right? He's just really good at every facet of the game, continues to be a huge piece for this team, and looked really, really good in this series, both on the K'Sante and on the Ornn, being able to create so much for the rest of the team. And then Tong Yuan, I mean, he's really stepped up, I would say, in the Summer Split. You know, I wasn't exactly shocked to see that he was playing well. This is somebody who this organization has invested quite a bit in and felt very confident in playing because they really haven't gotten a lot of backup for him. You know, they brought in Angel, and Angel definitely looked better in the Spring Split. You know, Tong Yuan wasn't very good, but they felt comfortable enough to say that he was the full-time starting mid laner for this team moving into summer. And I was concerned about that move, but clearly they knew what they were talking about. He gets that super strong static Shiv LeBlanc in game number 2 and definitely makes EDG pay. Was definitely the standout member of the team. The laners, I would say, looking good, but Wei just being the one to facilitate it all. The top side of this map really was terrific for RNG. The bot side was good too, especially once they got the Draven rolling in game number 2, but really they weren't the focal point of this series. I think the top side definitely was, and that really was the standout for RNG overall, and it's why I think they're looking really good at the current moment. And then for EDG on the other side, they're just ridiculously inconsistent. I'm worried about this team, and I'm certainly worried about how they play the mid to late game, because, you know, even though I do think that their early games are fine, I think that there are moments, especially against bad teams, where this early game is just going to carry them across the finish line. This team cannot team fight, like, at all. Uzi is doing a good job of being able to be in position and deal damage, but nobody is peeling for him. Nobody is setting up anything, and, you know, I don't know who to blame for that. Uzi is the primary shot caller, so I don't really know what the issue is. I don't know if it's just everybody not being on the same page. I don't know if it's this team not really understanding how they want to play these fights, but they're just not good at that part of the game, like, at all. They don't really know what to do, and that was definitely the case. And so when they do lose early, kind of like they did in this series, I really don't see a lot of avenues for them to be able to get back into games. My dud of the series is going to go to Jeje in the jungle, who just got out jungled by Wei. He had really no pressure to kind of facilitating engaged junglers in both games, Maokai and the Poppy, and neither really looked all that good, especially after the early game. Fofo getting solo killed in game 2, giving over basically Nexus for free is pretty bad. Ale getting absolutely clapped in the top lane, playing these more supportive top lane carries, not good. Uzi is team fighting relatively well for this team, but, you know, it isn't really doing all that much. The team isn't peeling for him all that well, and really it feels like they're disconnected. Uzi's style of what he wants to do isn't necessarily on display, and Mako certainly hasn't been the game, you know, takeover force that he had been in previous splits, and so I don't really know what's going on with this EDG team. It just does not feel cohesive. It does not feel complete, and it worries me. This team kind of got bounced in this series, and if this team wants to be a top 6, top 7 team even, really, they need to get better than this, because right now they don't look like that. They look like a bottom tier playoff team, a first or a second round out at best, and that's not what this EDG team really needs to be. This was a team that had Worlds aspirations. Pretty no-brainer at the beginning of the split, and so really, they're not even looking close to that at the current moment, and they're going to need to step things up in order to even remotely get onto that level. But for RNG, they looked really good. This is a team that definitely looks better than number 9 in the power rankings at the moment. Maybe not a super team or anything like that. There are really good teams, especially in the top 5 or 6 right now, but RNG looks competitive. They look like a team that can go up against a lot of other teams in this league and actually look very good. And, you know, even if they're not maybe the best team in the league, I think they already have shown that they're going to outperform a lot of the expectations that people had for them this split. And then moving on to our third series here of day number 4, and it's a good one. It's one I think we were all really looking forward to. We had OMG taking on Team WE, and OMG is able to pick up the 2-1 series win, continuing their trend of losing game number 1 and then going on to win games 2 and 3 to take the series. And really, they're doing it in their own style, which I think we can all be incredibly excited about. A couple of hiccups here and there, especially in that game number 1. I'm looking at you, Shanji. Not exactly looking the best on the Darius, but the rest of the series, games 2 and 3, were actually really good from this OMG team, and they continue to look really, really solid. WE, on the other hand, their first real test rest of the split, unfortunately for them, does end in a series loss, but there was a lot of good things to take away from this series for them as well, and reasons to believe that they still are an intriguing team at this level, even if maybe not on the same level as OMG. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Abel in the bot lane. 3 games of Tristana, 3, really fun games overall. Of course, nobody else really picking up the Trist, although we have seen it rise a little bit more in popularity. We've seen other people at least try to play it. We've obviously seen some mid laners play it, but in the bot lane, there really aren't a lot of teams that are going to it, and Abel's played it in all 6 of his last 6 games, which is certainly something, and he's really good at Tristana. We always talk about this with Abel. He's got his own little eclectic champion pool. The Aphelios has always been a part of it. Obviously, the Samira is definitely the one that comes to mind when you think about him, but Tristana is definitely in that pool now. Those 3 champions definitely kind of describe him, I would say, overall. And you know what? He's really good at Tristana, especially being able to generate early leads, which you really need to do on that champion, especially in a meta where you're going into things like the Zeri. You need to be able to generate those early leads relatively consistently. And Abel was able to do that. Him and PP God, I think, generate a really, really strong 2v2, especially when you get him on something like the Blitzcrank. It's just really dangerous to have to play into them. It's very difficult to actually find a way to be able to generate any sort of success against them in the early game. And this team in general is really good at transitioning early game leads into the mid to late game because they do have very good communication and synergy together. And so I would say overall, this bot lane continues to be a big positive. Abel gets, another player of the series. I was a little bit questioning him at the beginning of the year, but he's been solid. PP God is definitely a positive for this team overall. The mid game, I'm not going to entirely associate with him just being a really good shot caller, but he is definitely a big positive for this team. And then Aki as well. Aki's not going to get nearly the kind of credit he deserves for this series, but man, if you don't have that engage coming out from either the Vi or the Sejuani in either of these games, especially that Sej in game number 3, I think the series is significantly harder. I think Aki continues to be one of the more underappreciated and honestly better junglers in the entire LPL. He's great at being the secondary carry, but he can carry games as well. He's just phenomenal at basically everything you want to ask him to do. His kind of leap this year, I think, is the biggest reason why OMG has taken that next step into being one of the scarier teams in the LPL. And then Shanji was really good in the back half of the series, especially on the Renekton in game 3, but that Darius game in game 1, not exactly great. Kind of got a little bit torched in that one, so couldn't exactly give him player of the series, but still, he looks really good when he wins. And then Cream, going up against Shanks, who has been kind of the powerhouse of WE, more than held his own, was the better mid laner, I would say, across this whole series, even if that wasn't the case in game number 1. Just good stuff overall from OMG. Cream has definitely taken more of a secondary carry role on this team, which I think is fine. Abel kind of getting more resources this year, I think, is an interesting change. And then Shanji really is like the guy on OMG, and it's fun to watch, but OMG in general are just a scary team because of how well they play together. And then for WE, I don't want to criticize them too much. This really was their first big challenge of the year, and I don't think they did awfully in this situation. I do think that there were a couple of players to point out. Hang, I think, could have been a lot better in that jungle position. I think that, you wanted more out of Shanks. You wanted more out of what he was going to be able to do around the map, but he was more isolated in that mid lane matchup. Looked really good on the Jace, but couldn't do too much. Hope and Awandi were fine, but they got kind of blasted in the 2v2 in both games 2 and 3. Just a lot of things where the players were good, but not great, right? And I think that's kind of the avenue that WE is going to end up falling into. I think that they're going to be a good team that is going to make some mistakes. Hang just doesn't seem like a jungler that's going to be able to go up against the best teams in the region and be able to consistently win. And the same thing can be said for this bot lane, in my opinion. They're just not going to be able to consistently win. I think Cube was a little bit of a negative towards the back half of the series, but he was actually really good in game number 1 on the Cassante. Definitely the best player in that game. And like I said, Shanks didn't exactly make any major errors, but mid lane was largely irrelevant across this entire series. And so for WE, you just need to get a little bit more aggressive, I would say. If you can get a better situation at 10, at 12 minutes against a team like OMG, I think you're going to be in a better spot, but not having a lot of early game pressure towards the back half of the series was a major problem for them, and I think it was a big reason why they walked out of the series with a loss. But they're fine. They kind of look like the gatekeepers right now. Them and RNG, I think, are in a very similar spot, a team that we just talked about as a team that is good enough to really be able to hang, I would say, with some of the better teams in the league, but maybe not be able to beat consistently, but is certainly better than the bottom tier teams and certainly should be a playoff team. That's where I see WE, even with their good record right now. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully they can continue to level up, but not the most, I would say, ecstatic showing from them. That's the word I'm looking for. And then for OMG on the other side, they're good. They're a good team. I'm still not exactly sure they're a top 4 world contender team because of the inconsistencies that they have with winning, winning a series 2-0, quite frankly, but they are a really solid team, and this is a team that we saw step up in the playoffs last split. If they can do that again, they could be a team that ends up making the World Championships. And then moving on to day number 5 now. The last 3 days here, of course, starting in day 3, we had super days, so already been in the swing of things. And we got a lower tier matchup, I would say, to start off day 5. We have LGD Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX picks up another 2-0 series win this week. That's a 2-0 week for FPX, and that's pretty damn good. Not really, I think, what a lot of people were expecting. I mean, they did have a pretty easy schedule this week, and we'll get into that later this week as well, but a couple of these players stepping up and showing that they are not a bottom 2, bottom 3 team at the very least. At the very worst, they are competitive and deserve to be considered maybe in a tier with like Rare Adam. And I think a lot of it is the development of like a lot of the players that we didn't necessarily believe in going into the split. Obviously, I like Care a lot as a player, but and LWX and Chocho, I think we all had expectations of being relatively fine, especially against bad teams. I expected them to be able to do pretty well against the lower tier bot lanes in the league. No offense, like Envy and Jinjiao, but I think it's really been the top side of this map that has made FPX's week so interesting. My player of the series is once again going to go to Zhao Laohu, who was really, really good in this series. He dominated both games in the team fights, if I'm being entirely honest. You go back and watch the film of what was going on in this series, and really the one player that you're going to consistently be talking about in terms of the team fights is Zhao Laohu, and that's not what I expected. If you've been following the channel for a little while, again, I think I said this earlier this week already, but I'm not the biggest fan of Zhao Laohu. I'm certainly not the biggest fan of his resume in the LPL already, but obviously FPX has seen the skill and they trust him enough to be able to run with him for as long as they have. I just haven't exactly seen it on stage, but this week was definitely kind of a showing of what they've seen in him for all of these years. He's going to be easily player of the series. He looked fantastic for FPX, and honestly, he looked great in both series that they played so far this week. Really like what we've seen from him. I'm not going to compare him to, anybody that's going to be revolutionary, but, a player that I talked pretty, poorly about across his career up until a point last year where he kind of figured it out was Kingen on DRX. And I'm not saying that Zhao Laohu can turn into a Kingen type of player, but I do think that they have relatively similar playstyles of both wanting to be more, secondary carries from the top side, more team fight threats from the top side, not individual laners, but, people who stepped up and really started to gel with a lot of their teammates last year. I think that is definitely, hopefully something that Zhao Laohu can turn into, and this was a really good sign of that. Again, I'm not going to completely throw out my, 2 or 3 year long analysis of this player because he had a really good week here in week number 4, but he had a really good week here in week number 4, so it's definitely something to keep in mind. But rest of the team was also really good. Love how Chocho played in this series on the Lulu. Aphelios Lulu's been one of those lanes that I think has honestly lost popularity as a lot of these other enchanters have really grown in popularity. Things like the Milio, things like the Yumi, obviously gaining a lot more prio over something like the Lulu, but Chocho still plays Lulu at a very high level, and he was really good. LWX did everything he needed to do in this series. They were definitely the better bot lane out of these two, and then I honestly think Hacker played relatively well, going into a jungler and Meteor that, so many analysts seem to be super high on at the current moment, especially on social media, and honestly, Hacker was probably the better jungler in this series. Again, another instance of Sion jungle just not being very good. I don't think I've seen this pick, work a single time in competitive so far. I get the idea behind it, it just isn't working, and so I don't understand why teams are going to continuously go to it, but whatever, if you believe in it, you believe in it, but when you're getting out jungled by Hacker on Sion jungle, that's how you know it's not working. It's just not going to go well. Care was fine this series, but honestly, you could make a case that Care was probably the weak link of FPX across this entire series, and so interesting stuff from this team. They're definitely showing things that we haven't exactly seen from them in the past, but, if they're going to be able to win on it, who am I to complain about it? And so for LGD on the other side, I think that win earlier this week maybe gave some fans some more confidence than maybe they should have had. Of course, this has been the game one team, the best of one team in the LPL across this year so far, but not in this series. They kind of got blasted by FPX. They were certainly the worst team across this series. My dud of the series is going to go to Decade in the top lane. Has not really looked all that good ever since coming in for Fearness. Would have liked to see the Fearness matchup because obviously he played for FPX most of last split, I should say, and Decade kind of taking his job is certainly indicative of how this team really just isn't gelling and clicking right now, but LGD isn't a good team. Don't let the best of one wins fool you. Don't let the fact that they've been competitive in some series fool you. They've been absolutely blasted in a lot of games by bad teams this year, and this is just another example of that. This top side is a problem, and as much as I like Meteor, he really has looked significantly worse on picks that aren't either Vi or obviously Kindred and Graves, which he's kind of known for, and then the rest of this team certainly has not been consistent. Envy and Jinzhao got outplayed pretty hard in this series, and that's kind of been a theme even against mid-tier bot lanes, which is concerning. And as good as Haichao was, it's not like he's been great over the course of this split. This was one of his better performances, and I would argue that he was the better mid laner in this series, but again, only so much he could do across the map. I would have liked to see him be a lot more aggressive, but instead he tried to play it passive, didn't exactly make mistakes, and nobody on this team was willing to step up and win them the game. And so for LGD, dropping 0-2 to FBX is like disastrous. That is really not what you wanted to see, and it just really confirms that this is not a very good team in the league right now. They still are a bottom 3-ish team in the league, even with that win earlier in the week, and I know that there's a lot of hype around them as a team that could potentially go on a late season run, but I don't see it personally. And then for FPX, they're solid. I mean, 3-5 is not an awful record considering where a lot of teams in the LPL are at the current moment, and so you're going to be relatively okay with that. I just don't see like crazy upside from this team. Maybe they can compete with teams like Ultra Prime and Rare Atom. That's kind of the group I think they're going to want to hit, but, you know, playoff hype might be a little bit too much for me, even if the team continues to play well. And then moving on to our second series of day number 5 here, and it's a matchup that I think people were intrigued to see just to see if we would get any sort of surprises. We didn't, as we saw Ultra Prime taking on LNG Esports, and LNG does get the job done in 2, which is a really good sign. Of course, we had been relatively critical of LNG up until this point. I think that there had been some good for this team. They had done a good job being able to take out teams that they should be able to beat, but weren't necessarily consistent enough to be able to take down the best teams in the league, or at least that's what they had shown up until this point. But Ultra Prime kind of falling somewhere in the middle, a team that has definitely overperformed expectations and has looked relatively competitive, but like on paper just should not be able to go up against a team like LNG, and that was definitely the case in this series. While there were good moments from Ultra Prime, some things that I do think they did well, LNG was definitely the better team overall, and I think they showed that. And again, I'm gonna be super repetitive when I say this, but when this team wins, it is very obviously through mid lane, and my player of the series is going to go to Scout. Again, it's just what this team knows. It's how they like to play. I'm not sure if that's a Tarzan and Scout thing. I'm not sure if it's a Gala thing, but this is the playstyle that LNG obviously excelled on in Spring Split, and it's something that when they've tried to go away from it in Summer Split, they haven't looked nearly as consistent. But when they do play for Scout, when they allow him to be the big primary resource getter on an early game champion like the Jace, he really is able to take over that early and mid game and be able to really put LNG in a spot where, you know, Gala can just team fight towards the back half and really not have to worry too much. A couple of early game comps coming out from LNG, or at least what you would associate with early game comps, especially game 1 Renekton and Jace. You know, even Xayah always going to be put in that, you know, little box. I would say the Jax definitely helps in game 2, but still, it's clear the path that they want to go and the playstyle that they want to have, which is win in the early game, try to transition that into the mid game, which can be a relatively volatile way to play the game, but we've seen teams at the LPL level succeed with that in the past. That's what BLG basically did in the playoffs last split, and so I don't really hate it. Scout continues to just be awesome. He's going to get underrated because this team is having trouble beating some of the better teams in the league, but it is certainly not his fault. He has been the most consistent player on this team by a large margin, and honestly, any positives that I said about Scout in spring when I called him my MVP, they carry over here to summer. He still is one of the best players in the LPL, and I think he continuously proves it. Gala continues to be good when this team plays well, and that really is kind of the difference, I would say, is when he's allowed to kind of just do his own thing and, you know, play 2v2 and just kind of scale up into the mid to late game and be really consistent. I think he's going to look really good as an AD carry, but when the rest of the team's not performing well, when he has to play from a gold deficit, it doesn't really seem like he's the type of player that's going to drag this team out of their hole. Now, he's been really good in their wins. I definitely want to say that, and I do think that he has the potential to be better than that, but it feels like something hasn't fully clicked. It's not that it's not clicked. Like, there are a couple of new additions to teams that I feel like are not working in terms of synergy. I would not say Gala is one of those. I think that there is synergy between this team. I just don't think it's like 100% yet. Him and Hang definitely have different playstyles, so I think Hang is definitely taking more of a back seat, which I think is the right call. Get Gala familiar with everything that they want to do, but, you know, LNG in general is fine. Tarzan was successful in this series playing Maokai. You know, if he's going to be fine as a facilitator, that's all that this team needs, and I've been saying that. He just needs to be Tarzan. He doesn't need to be this big, you know, super carry for this team. You've got Scout, you've got Gala. They can win games for you, so if Tarzan's consistent, they'll be fine. And then Zika was really good in this series, being able to win in the top lane matchup, especially early on in lane where Harry does struggle a little bit. And so LNG LNG looking really solid, like this team a lot. And then for Ultra Prime on the other side, just a couple of like very noticeable mistakes. Forge was miserable in this series. There really was no other way to say it. He's going to get my dud of the series. And honestly, I'm really not all that in on Forge as a mid laner. I think he's fine. I think that there are going to be games where he looks okay, but I think overall he's certainly not someone that's going to push your team forward. And Ultra Prime's kind of in a position right now where they kind of need a mid laner like that because this team is overperforming expectations. Forge just got completely destroyed in this series, even on the LeBlanc in game number 1 that everybody sees as ridiculously OP. Like, his early games were so miserable, and that Annie game in game 2 was like unplayably bad. And so pretty easy choice for dud of the series, just not a good showing from him. Ning's scoreline looks awful, but he was at least trying to make plays for this team. He was the only one that was really going out and attempting to do something. He spent a lot of time and resources top lane, and there were moments where that looked okay for Harry, who I do think is an okay player, but it's not going to be a combo that's good enough to be able to take down LNG, that's for sure, and certainly isn't going to be able to stand up to what like Scout's going to be able to do in the mid lane. And so wasn't particularly successful, but at the very least, again, was trying to make plays. A lot of people are dogging on Sword Art, pun not intended with Doggo on this team. I didn't even think about it. People are really hating on Sword Art. I actually think Sword Art's been relatively good this split. Maybe not like a superstar or anything like that, not like a standout fantastic support, but I think him and Doggo actually have surprisingly good chemistry, and I think they've been fine, but he wasn't all that good in this series, especially on the Nautilus in game 2. I still don't think he's nearly as big of a problem as other people will tell you. I saw a bunch of comments saying that, you know, they'll never win a single game with Sword Art on this team. That's just obviously wrong. They're 4-4. Like, come on. And Sword Art honestly has been playing a ton better than he did on AL and hell, even the last few years. And so, you know, I'm not going to shit on him right now. I think he's been fine for this team, even if he wasn't great in this series. And Doggo's just kind of there. I still think he's the best player on this team that no one really talks about, but Ning is going to make or break what the season ends up doing for Ultra Prime. And so they're who we think they are. They are probably number 11 or number 12 in the power rankings, a team that is probably just outside of the playoff bracket considering everybody else that has already gotten their chance there, but, you know, is competitive and will be able to at least go toe-to-toe against some of the worst teams in the league. And then for LNG, hopefully they're able to kind of find some sort of, you know, footing in terms of, you know, their consistency, because they're a really talented team and we know they're going to be able to play well. It's just not been able to happen against the best teams in the league. Hopefully they can start generating some confidence and kind of finish off their growth as a team to kind of get there, but this is just a win over Ultra Prime. It's hard to really take too much out of it. And then moving on to our third series of day number 5 here, and this is the one I think a lot of people were really waiting for. Maybe the match of the week here, as we saw Top Esports taking on JD Gaming. And JDG gets the job done with a 2-0 series win. Congrats to this team. It really does feel like Weibo is their only kryptonite in the LPL, because basically every other challenger that they have gone up against has not been able to compete with the sheer raw talent that they are putting out here. And it's really, really fun to watch. JDG just looks utterly dominant. I know we talked about this team maybe running into some burnout problems after MSI, because they had the full playoffs and then they had a full MSI and now this really condensed schedule, and a lot of these players are going to be playing in the Asian games, and it's like, man, are they ever going to get a rest? Are they going to look a lot worse, a lot less consistent when they're maybe not having as much time and as much of a break in between a lot of these games? Well, that has not necessarily been a problem for this team. It feels like a lot of the worries that we had about them, even at the beginning of this LPL split when they still were winning, just maybe not as decisively, are kind of gone at the current moment. They just look fantastic. They just look like a lot of fun. Player of the series pretty easily is going to go to Kanavi in the jungle, who just dominated this matchup. This was a massive jungle gap, which we will get into in a bit, but Kanavi just looks fantastic. He's looked great ever since MSI. You know, I've talked about it a lot on the channel, but he was looking a little bit inconsistent in the regular season in spring, and then in the playoffs, he also had some moments where he wasn't quite as dominant as I think maybe, you know, some people would want him to be with the talent around him, but that has certainly not been the case since MSI. Everyone on this team is clicking at the current moment. I would say there is not a single player on this team that I would consider even remotely a weak link, and Kanavi stepping up, I think, is really a big reason for that. His ability to path in the early game and generate leads for his laners and really just allow them the opportunity to play the game that they want to play is fantastic. That's all you need to do when you have talent like this. We talk about it all the time. Sometimes you just need to not get in the way of your best players, and Kanavi, ironically enough, does such a fantastic job of not getting in the way. He is a great player who can carry, but it really isn't his role on JDG. He allows Knight, he allows Ruler to be able to step up and just win games by themselves by taking away all of the external factors that could stop them from doing that, and I think that really is the positive overall for what Kanavi offers this team. Of course, if they need him to carry, he absolutely still can do that. We know he's one of the best carry junglers in the entire world, and so just a really fantastic player, and his ability to step up and be whatever this team needs is a big reason why they're as dangerous and dominant as they have been. win, but everybody else was also good here. 369 was phenomenal in the top lane, absolutely decimated Wayward. Knight was so much better than Rookie, it's actually absurd. Ruler and Missing were definitely the better bot lane here. JDG are just like gapping everybody, and it's really fun to watch. This team has incredible synergy together. They have a great idea for how they want to play the game, and they know how to execute on everything they want to do. And then for top esports, there's going to be a lot of conversation around this series, a lot of overreacting, as there always is, but as you know on this channel, I'm not going to overreact. You can go to every social media and you can see top esports are frauds, Tian is the worst jungle. I've seen countless takes of like Xiao Hao and Meteor would be better for this top esports team than Tian, because Tian's worse than them as a player. And, you know, congratulations to all these people for farming their karma on Reddit and for, you know, using sensationalized news in order to generate, you know, whatever popularity they have on the internet, but it's just not true. Like, I get it, Tian had a really bad series here, and I'm not trying to downplay that. He was heavily out-jungled in this series, and he is going to get my dud of the series overall, but are we going to throw out the other 8 series that they played up until this point and forget that he's, like, legitimately been one of the best junglers in the LPL in summer so far? Because if that's the case, then sure, whatever. If we want to overreact to 2 games, go ahead. If you want to say that these 2 games are significantly more important than any of the, whatever, you know, 20 plus that he's played across the season, you know, that's your opinion to have. But Tian's been fantastic for this top esports team. He just didn't have it today. And that can happen with Tian. He's a very feast or famine player, but he's actually having a really good split overall. And he was the MVP last year, for crying out loud. No, Xiao Hao and Meteor are not better than him. What an absurd take to have. I hate to say it, but what an absurd take to have. The rest of this team wasn't exactly lighting the world on fire anyways. Rookie picking Aurelion Sol in game 2. I hear he's still scaling to this day. I'm not exactly sure he did a single pit of damage in that game outside of regular poke in lane. Really was completely useless. Jackie 11 Mark kind of lost the early game, especially in that game number 2, which they really needed to win, and then really couldn't recover. This was really the first laning phase that Jackie Love has not utterly dominated this year, and yes, it's against Ruler, but, you know, it's certainly something to keep in mind, and Wayward was just completely outplayed by 369 in the top lane. As bad as Tian was in this game, and yes, it was a big jungle gap, and he definitely deserves dud of the series, he was far from the only player on top esports that was worthy of criticism, and so to just blame everything on him, again, it's irrational, and it's coming from a place of just wanting to find a scapegoat instead of actually trying to identify what any of the actual problems are. And so I still think top esports is a good team. I just think JDG is that much better than everybody in the league right now. Top esports, I expect to be able to bounce back from this, but JDG is going to continue their run at the top of the standings. They're going to continue to look like one of the best teams in the world, if not the single best team in the world by like a considerably large margin, and especially against the best teams, they show who they really are. And then moving on to day number 6 here in week 4 of the LPL, and we kicked day 6 off with a little bit of an upset as we saw Team WE taking on ThunderTalk Gaming. And ThunderTalk picks up their second series win of the split here with a win over WE, who, you know, going into this week was undefeated, looked relatively good, but had a lot of games to play to catch up for their ability to play in week 3. And I think that it might be a little bit of a problem for them. They dropped that first series to OMG, and they looked competitive against a good team, but ThunderTalk has been spiraling for a little while now, and so for them to be able to come out and just win this series 2-1, like, that is surprising. It certainly was a little bit of an upset for me, but good for this ThunderTalk team. We know they do have talent. We know these players are really good. We just need to see them be able to step up and get their heads back on their shoulders, because it feels like whatever this organization, whatever management is currently doing is just taking it off at the current moment. And luckily for them, they still have a lot of good players. The talent can still seep through in a lot of situations, and that's kind of exactly what happened for ThunderTalk in this series. Player of the series, no brainer, going to go to UCal in the mid lane. He's kind of been the constant thread for this team. You can talk about how Hoya started the season pretty bad. They can't figure out which jungler they want to play. 1XN has his moments, but he also has his bad moments we'll get into, and Yao Yao's honestly not been very good. But UCal has been kind of the thread that has kept everything together for ThunderTalk on the Rift, and it clearly showed in this series again. The 2 games of LeBlanc are definitely what you're going to point to and say, wow, like, he was really, really good in this series, and he absolutely was. He was better than Shanks, which is pretty massive, because I think Shanks is a really good player and someone who started the season incredibly hot in the first couple of weeks, and so to see UCal just kind of outplay him here, I think it just goes to show that he still is the guy that he was in spring. He still is the guy that he was in summer of 2022, where he's really making a case to be, you know, kind of that upper mid-tier of LPL mid laners. There are so many good ones in the league, but UCal around number 6, 7, 8, somewhere somewhere in that range, I think is very fair. In terms of the mid lane rankings, he continues to be a massive positive for this team overall. And then the rest of this team, I think, was also relatively good. Beixuan had a really good series. And again, I know people don't want to hear that because people love Xiao Huangren and they just want to see him. And honestly, whatever. Yeah, I'm not for or against that at this point. But Beixuan is still a good jungler at this level. And he heavily out-jungled Hang in this series. There were a couple of moments in the early game where it felt like Hang was doing some good things because that's the part of the game that he feels the most comfortable in. But when we did get to those mid-game skirmishes and especially late-game teamfights, Beixuan was so clearly outperforming his opposition that it really was just like a complete gap, in my opinion. So Beixuan, Yukao looking really good. Hoya looked strong on the Renekton, a pick that I think is doing really well in the LPL right now. 1xN looked good in teamfights, but man, he'll have a couple of moments here or there every single game where he is just like so far out of position. And that's kind of the worry for me, and that's the reason that I've been hesitant to say that he's this big next up-and-coming AD carry superstar for ThunderTalk is he just makes some like really, really bad errors, at least once, twice, maybe even 3 times a game, right? And I don't know if he's going to be able to weed those out. We've seen players at this level have those issues before and not be able to do that. It is much more rare that we see players figure it out and get more consistent, but hopefully, I think for this team's sake, you're hoping he can figure it out. And then Yao Yao was just significantly more consistent. This was actually a great series from Yao Yao. Honestly, 1xN was the player that I was the least confident in when it came to ThunderTalk. A couple of major mistakes that actually kept WE in this series, especially in game number 3, but for the most part, ThunderTalk was definitely good enough, and this jungle mid duo kind of put them forward. Then for WE, you've got to be scared. You've got to at least be a little bit worried because this team had a very easy schedule to start the split, and they did really well with that easy schedule, but now they're actually facing some competition. Not that ThunderTalk has exactly been good this split, but WE is really not holding up, in my opinion, and that's going to scare, I think, a lot of people. Hang is going to get my dud of the series, and that's not the last one, or it's not the first one, I should say, that he got this week. And it's definitely a concern. His inability to teamfight, I think, is definitely an issue for WE, especially on that Volley Bear in game 1, which was like one of the worst games that I've watched a jungler play in quite a long time. Just no pressure in the early or late game, but, you know, he was able to generate pressure in game 3, even on the Vi, he just did nothing with it, and that's kind of been the case for Hang over the course of this split. He's becoming a little bit of a weak link for WE, and as much as I did like him in spring, and I think he showed some upside, especially as an early game facilitator, the consistency is just not there, and it really does feel like when he goes up against a team that knows what to do in the mid game, he really has no answer to that, and that is definitely something that could hold WE back as a team. We've seen teams not be good because of their jungle position, and WE definitely does not want to be one of them. The rest of this team wasn't also all that great. Cube was fine on the top side, but really wasn't, extraordinary. You want to see a little bit more out of them. I think the positives are like Hope and Awandi down in the bot lane, who had a really good game too, and the Lucian Nami were able to generate a lead and then just kind of take over the game from there. But Hope is one of those players that does kind of need the rest of his team to be playing well in order for him to look as good as he can. Not that he's a bad player, but again, I put him more in that tier of like Doggo and Fodic and kind of that middle tier of AD carries rather than anything higher, because I do think he's more team dependent than some of the best AD carries in the region. But he's still a good player that if you put resources into can look good. It's just the consistency with this team, and it's always going to be the consistency with this team. They look okay against bottom teams, but I am going to be a little bit concerned after the series with WE's outlook over the course of the rest of the split. And then ThunderTalk, really big win for confidence here. Hopefully they can keep it up, because if this team can even remotely get back to where they were playing towards, spring and the back half of last year, like they were a playoff team last split for a reason. I'm not saying that that's in the cards for them this split, because starting 1-7 is a pretty disastrous way to start your split, and it probably excludes you from playoff contention just in general, but at the very least, we want to see this team be able to play games and look relatively competitive like they should. And then moving on to our second series of day number 6 here, and it's a little bit of a bottom-of-the-table clash, but certainly an intriguing one here, as we saw FunPlus Phoenix taking on Anyone's Legend, and AL picks up kind of the surprising win here. FPX was kind of rolling this week against, pretty bad competition, Invictus, LGD, teams that they should be able to beat, kind of proving that they aren't the bottom of the standings, but in comes AL, who looked really bad earlier on in the week against that LGD team, and they kind of pounce on them for a really nice win in this series. And there are just a couple of players that I think are definitely a little bit better on the side of AL than what FPX has, and I think that was a little bit of a problem. I think talent-wise, both of these teams have avenues in which they can win, but the consistency just really isn't there for either team, which is why neither of them are really playoff contenders at the current moment. But a good win for AL to get their second series win of the year. Player of the series for me was actually kind of difficult. It felt like nobody on AL individually was really all that dominant. It was more of a team effort, but for me, I'm going to give player of the series to Xiao Hao in the jungle. Of course, Obviously, I'm a big fan of him as a player, but I do think that he created a lot for AL this series, a lot of setups in game number 1, allowing the rest of this team to do well. Obviously, shout out to ZDZ. We'll get to him in a minute. That game 1 is hilarious to talk about just in general, but really, Xiao Hao's getting this for the game 3, where he really was the reason that they ended up winning that game. I thought he was the most explosive. He was setting up plays for Harder and for iBoy and for ZDZ to be able to capitalize on, and I think the team really played around him incredibly well. He can be more of a facilitator as well. It's why I like him a lot as a player. Obviously he's a very good carry, and I think obviously you go back to things like the Lee Sin that he's gotten really, really famous on, but he can play Sejuani at a very high level. He can play Vi and you know, all these picks, Wukong at a very high level as well, Maokai. And so I just think he's a very versatile jungler, a very solid jungler, somebody who I've talked about plenty on this channel. You know I like Xiao Hao, and I think he's my player of the series here. But ZDZ, you gotta give him a big shout out. Ends up getting player of the game in game 1 on the NAR with a 0% KP percentage. Insane stuff, just a really wild game, a really wild end, and, you know, he was actually really good across this whole series. Even on the Jax, I thought he was relatively good as well. I was definitely considering him for player of the series, but for me, Xiao Hao was just a little bit more consistent across all of the games, but it would be criminal not to mention ZDZ as a big positive for AL, and it really was the top side of the map that I think created a lot of the differences for AL in this series. Harder was good in the mid lane, certainly capitalized on a lot of the things that Xiao Hao was setting up, and by the way, both Harder and iBoy are subbed back in here. It looks like it's going to be a little bit of a switcheroo here for AL. I'm not exactly sure who's going to be playing the more reps out of the two groups of like Pins and Yi or Harder and iBoy. I don't exactly know which side's going to be getting more, but Harder and iBoy stepping in here and being all right. Harder especially was pretty good, but iBoy and Zora just continue to have like no chemistry. I still think iBoy's not very good. This bot lane was kind of thrashed in this series, if I'm being entirely honest, and if AL was going to lose this series, it was because of this bot lane, and so not exactly what you really wanted to see from iBoy, and I'm going to continue to go out on a limb and say that he's just not an LPL caliber AD carry anymore, and that there's really no reason not to go for Yi, who has just shown so much more over the start of this split. If you want to do that with Harder, if you want to do that with Pins, whatever, just figure it out. But Zora also, I think, has definitely not been great to start this split. This bot lane in general has just been very bad for AL, and I think that that was a trend that continued in this series, but at the very least, they were able to pick up the win, which is all that really matters here. And then for FPX on the other side, really unfortunate. This had the makings of being a 3-0 week for this team, which I think they would have really, really loved, but unfortunately, they stumble down at the finish line and just allow AL to outpressure them in a lot of these games. Not really what I expected. Big shout out to LWX and Chocho, who, like I said, were definitely the better bot lane in this series and was one of the better series, I think, in general that they played in a while. Yes, in my opinion, they're going into one of the weaker bot lanes in the entire region, but you still have to be able to step up and actually perform in instances like that, and it really did feel like they did, and so credit to them, but nobody else on this team was particularly good. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Hacker in the jungle. Xiao Hao had infinite pressure in the series, especially in AL's wins, and I think a lot of that was Hacker just not really having any sort of early game dominance, and that's just what he is. He's not a very good jungler at this level. Care continues to really disappoint. He's having a very bad summer split, and you really hate to see it because I like him a lot as a player. And then Xiao Lao, who couldn't follow up his really good early start to the week. I still don't think he was actually all that bad. There were certainly moments in lane that I actually really liked what Xiao Lao, who was actually able to do, and I think in general, this was easily the best week of his entire career, and, you know, we'll talk about player of the weeks, but, like, he's still in contention even with this loss, but he was not the game record that I think he was, you know, especially in that previous series that they played against LGD, but overall, FPX is still a bottom tier team. Just because they got some wins against some bad teams earlier in the week doesn't mean that they are immune to losing games to teams like AL, and you know, I still think that they're going to be near the bottom of the standings as we move along. But for AL, it's a nice win to get. I don't know how sustainable this is, especially if the bot lane continues to be such a massive problem. But Xiao Hao's a good player. ZDZ can step up, even though he's relatively inconsistent. And there is talent on this team. It's just about getting it out more frequently. And then our final series here of day number 6, and it is a good one. Two really good teams at the current moment. We had Weibo Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming. And BLG does take the 2-1 series win here. BLG just looks genuinely unstoppable against anybody that isn't JD Gaming. And you've got to be impressed with what this team has been able to do over the course of this year so far. I mean, the consistency and the growth that they have shown. I know I've talked about it in previous videos, but for those who don't watch every single LPL video, how impressed I am with BLG has gone through the roof over the course of the year. We were talking about them a lot in the spring regular season as a team that had so much potential, had a couple of players that were really performing well. Elk and On, in particular, were big standouts in the regular season last split. Elk getting MVP votes, you know, an MVP finalist for me. but it didn't feel like the team was ever coming together. Jun and Yagao, in particular, didn't feel like they had great chemistry together and weren't exactly playing off of each other in a way that was making this team dangerous, and Bin had one of his weaker regular seasons in a while. So for this team to bounce back, have that fantastic playoff run, make the LPL finals, not be able to overcome JDG, but then go on to MSI and make the MSI finals as well. Again, not being able to overcome JDG. Now they're sitting at 8-1, their only loss being to, you guessed it, JDG. They're just unbelievable. They're the growth and the consistency that this team has shown over the past few months is incredibly commendable, and honestly, I really respect this team for being able to become what they are now. And honestly, you know, I talked about it at the beginning, the player that's been consistent throughout the whole time for them has been my player of the series, Elk, in the bot lane. He's just so freaking good. I've been on the Elk train for quite a while. Go back to basically any video where I talked about Ultra Prime last year, and I'm like, man, Elk is way too good to be on this team. This team is actively losing games despite how well he is playing at the AD carry position, consistently getting wins in the bot lane and not being able to translate it into the same kind of leads that he needed. It was unfortunate. It was certainly a frustrating circumstance, but you finally put good talent around him, and man, he's one of the best AD carries in the entire world, period. End of story. There is no more debating it. He was that at MSI. He's been that again here in the LPL. He's just everything you could ask for and more. He was fantastic in this series, especially in game number 3 on the Aphelios. He can play any style, early game. He can definitely dominate the 2v2 in lane. He can be really good towards the back half as a carry. He'll just do everything you need at a super high level. On is also great. Obviously, he's been one of the best supports in the entire world for the whole year. Another player who I've been very high on, but really glad to see Elk get a little bit more of a spotlight. On definitely has taken a lot of the shine, I would say, at the beginning of the split, so it's nice to be reminded that Elk is still, you know, that guy, one of the best players in the world. And then Jun, what a great series from Jun, and honestly, he's sneakily been, like, the best jungler in the LPL to start this split. I was kind of out on Jun, not in a negative way. I was just like, man, him and Yagao are not clicking. You know, back in the regular season, I was like, I think Yagao has a lot of upside, but playing for Jun has not necessarily worked for this team, and that's really what Yagao wants to do as a mid laner, but man, whatever happened in the playoffs was real, and they figured it out. Jun was one of the best players at MSI, and he's arguably been the best jungler in the LPL to start this split. Just crazy consistent stuff coming out from him, and he's been the big game changer, I would say. Elk and On were already good in spring, but the reason this team is now 8-1 and looking to be relatively unstoppable, even against good teams, is Jun's transformation in the jungle. So good stuff from him. Bin and Yagao were also really good, but it definitely was a jungle bot kind of performance coming out from BLG. And then for Weibo on the other side, this team is still really good. Honestly, a lot of really big positives to take away from them. They were able to take a game off of BLG. Not a lot of teams in the league have been able to do that up until this point. So for Weibo to do that and stay relatively competitive in this series, it's certainly something to commend them for. There were a couple of hiccups here and there, but the bot lane was still really good. Light is just so freaking consistent, man. Even against the best teams in the league. I know people don't like to say, you know, they don't like to put Light in the conversation for one of the best AD carries in the LPL, but he is. He's one of the best AD carries in the LPL. He's arguably a top 5 ADC in the world, and I really do think that, you know, going up against anybody, I trust him. I trust him in almost any matchup, and that's the impressive part. Whether it's against an aggressive ADC or a more passive, you know, scale into the late game kind of ADC, he can do everything on the Rift, and so really believe in the talent there. And then I thought Xiaohu continued to be good. They were the two players that definitely impressed the most for Weibo, not only in this series, but across this entire week number 4. But top side of the map, not necessarily a huge positive for this team. The Shy is going to get my dud of the series. Obviously, game number 3, super frustrating to watch if you're a Weibo fan, because it felt like they really had that game under control. Like, they should have been able to take that third and final game. Unfortunately, just some awful team fighting coming out from this team. Some pretty bad decision-making at the Elder Dragon that ends up giving that over to BLG and just basically, you know, ending the game right then and there. And the Shy was a big part of that on the Kennen, just playing a really bad game. He's just very inconsistent for this team. I think this team can win a lot of games as long as the Shy doesn't get in their way, but right now, I'm just not convinced about that. And Weiwei, I think, also took a pretty big step back in this series. Jun was by far the better jungler, especially towards the back half of that game number 3, and so definitely some things to watch out for on the top side of the map for this Weibo team, but still, there are a lot of positives. They're going up against one of the best teams in the league. I'm not going to over worry about the problems that they showed in this series. I still think they're a very good team and a team that pretty much everybody's going to have to watch out for, but inconsistency has been a problem for them in the past, so it's something to watch out for. But for BLG, they're freaking good, man. They're a top 2 team in the league. JDG seems to be their only kryptonite here in the LPL. They seem to pretty regularly be able to handle almost anybody else at this level, and that's going to be an incredibly scary prospect come playoff time. And then moving on to our 7th and final day here in week 4 of the LPL. Man, these videos really do take a while to make. I really do appreciate you guys sticking with me through them. We had a matchup between two 4-4 teams, Ultra Prime taking on Royal Never Give Up. And RNG is able to get the job done in Sue. They are still the gatekeepers, and they still look actually pretty good. There are a couple teams above them in the power rankings that are struggling a bit this week, and so RNG actually having a relatively good week and bouncing back into a position where they're now above 500 is certainly going to play into their favor. They actually looked really good across this entire week, and in this series in general, they were definitely the better of these two teams, and that's kind of what you would want to see. RNG absolutely should be better than Ultra Prime in terms of talent level, but it's really where they were able to generate those leads that I think is most impressive. So let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the series is going to go to Tongyuan in the mid lane. This is fantastic news. Tongyuan actually had a really good week for RNG. He looked great in both of their series, and man, if he can get online, if he can be even remotely more consistent than what he had been last split, where they really felt like they had to go in a different direction in order to even make the playoffs, then man, this team's upside is significantly higher than what they had in spring, and that's a really good sign. Obviously, talked about him a bit earlier in the week. I said that obviously RNG saw something in him. There was a reason they felt comfortable enough to let Angel go and to let Tongyuan be the full-time starter here in the mid lane for this team that does want to win right about now, and so clearly, he had a lot of expectations going into the split, and honestly, this was the first series where I really was like, okay, he can live up to those. He can be a really good mid laner. He had been very inconsistent up until this point, but the Annie is certainly a pick that I think has helped him a lot. Now, I'm not going to throw out my analysis entirely and just say that Tongyuan is definitely one of the best players, you know, at this level, and he's one of the best mid laners, and yada, yada, yada. He's looked really good on Annie in both of the series that he played this week, but man, I got to see it on more than Annie and Ahri. I get that they're the meta picks, and they look really good right now, but the consistency to be able to carry games on things that don't have such, I don't want to say hard-coded engage, but things that really are a little bit more easy to execute, especially when the rest of your team is setting you up well. I want to see what Tongyuan does when he's put in those circumstances, because those were the problems that he was running into in the spring split. But at least for now, the role he's being asked to do, he's fulfilling at a very high level, and that's certainly worth pointing out. Breathe and Wei continue to also be very good. I think Breathe got a little bit overhyped for that game number 1, but he was still really good in game 2, and Wei just continues to be such a rock for this team in the jungle. Legitimately one of the most consistent players in the entirety of the LPL this split, and that's surprising because I was kind of trashing him in spring, if I'm going to be entirely honest with you. I was kind of worried about him going into a split where now the rest of his teammates weren't nearly as good. This was somebody who hadn't really proven anything before he joined RNG, and really didn't prove anything last split when RNG's talent level decreased, and so I was worried that that was going to become a little bit of a trend for him, but no, he's been fantastic. I see some MVP callouts for him, and while I'm definitely not on that train, I certainly don't think that that is a conversation I'm willing to have at this point. I do think that he has been very good for this team, and certainly a positive, but man, Lumao's really good too, and he's not going to get nearly the same kind of credit that a player like Wei is going to get. I get that he's not the same brand name and recognizable figure that Wei is, but Lumao has been just as good across this entire split, in my opinion. Has really meshed well with LP in the bot lane, and man, that Lulu game in game 1, he absolutely should have been player of the game. Just a really good series overall, and he's been very consistently good for this team. He's not exactly this game wrecker, but man, he just makes everybody else in the team look as good as they possibly can, and I think that's a really underrated ability for him. So Tongyuan definitely looking great, but Lumao definitely someone I think deserves a lot more credit for how well he's been playing this split. But for Ultra Prime on the other side, man, I just got to talk about it. Forge was miserable this week. I mean, taking out their win at the beginning of the week, like their 2 losses this week, I mean, Forge was like horrendous. That he was unplayable in both of those series, and he's going to get out of the series again here in this second one. And man, like he's been bad this split. I know he's shown upside in the past, and I know people like him. I was pretty hesitant going into the split. There was a reason I ranked this team last in terms of my power ranking, is because I didn't believe in anybody on this team other than Doggo. Obviously, that's not necessarily been the case. People really like Harry, and I'm willing to admit that I'm maybe just a little bit lower than public opinion, and so I'm not going to criticize him too much for that, but Ning has been a lot better than people expected. Certainly Sword Art has been better than I expected, but Forge has been miserable for this team. One of the worst mid laners in the entire region, and if that's the case, they're still not going to be very good, and that's still going to be a problem for this team. He just has been a black hole in terms of laning and in terms of team fighting and just every part of the game. He dies so frequently, and he's unable to keep up with basically really any opponent. He's really not been good. Hopefully he's able to figure it out because he's been good in the past on different teams, but on Ultra Prime, at least this split, he has been a disaster, and it's really cost them a lot of games and a lot of time. I don't think anybody else was particularly great in this series. Harry certainly had his problems in the top lane, and again, I get, he's a great team fighter. He's a really, really good team fighter, but his laning needs a lot of work in order for me to really believe that he's going to be consistent, and again, that was the case in this series. It feels like I'm saying that a lot, but that's just kind of who he is as a player. He needs to improve his consistency in the 1v1s before I really, truly believe in him as an upper-tier top lane talent. Ning is still very aggressive, but it's not really going to work when the rest of the team's losing. Doggo, Sword Art, they're fine. People like to clown on Sword Art because he hasn't been good in recent years. He's been fine this split. Doggo, I think, is the best player on this team, and so for Ultra Prime, I really do think they could have won this series had their mid lane been a little bit more consistent. Maybe not won the series, but certainly had been more close in this game. It's not like anybody else was like horrendously bad. They just looked a little bit outclassed and they lost a lot of pressure early on. This is still an okay team. They're sitting just below 500, which is better than a lot of the bottom tier teams, but make no mistake, they definitely still are a bottom tier team. And then for RNG, they might be better than number 9. This is a team that I think has consistently proven that they are able to win against teams that are worse than them, which is better than I can say about some of the other teams that are surrounding them in the standings. They're now sitting above 500 with a 12-8 record, which is pretty damn good in terms of game score, and a lot of these players are starting to come into their own. Hopefully, if that development, especially for the young guys, can continue, this team can actually be a secret contender. And then moving on to our second series of day number 7 here, and it was another interesting one. Again, two teams with the same record. Moving into this series, we had Rare Adam taking on Edward Gaming. And EDG does get the job done, although it is just narrowly. This should not have been nearly as close as it was in this series, but EDG does pull out the victory, and I think EDG fans are going to be excited by that. Now, there is some reason to still be a little bit concerned, but it does feel like this team has found a little bit of a style that they can start to play to that maybe they can be a little bit more confident in, you know. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but Rare Adam actually still putting up a fight. I'm really not ready to completely give up on this team, and I think that there were a lot of reasons in this series to continue to try and support them and believe that they could turn into something more. But let's go ahead and talk about it. EDG ended up winning the series looking relatively good. There wasn't one player that I would point out as being the big standout, but of course, if I do have to give a player of the series, I finally get to give it to Uzi in the bot lane. It's his first player of the series, I think, on the channel. Honestly, the times that Uzi has overlapped in the LPL that I've been covering it, at least on a weekly basis, have just been BLG Uzi, which I would be surprised if I ended up giving a player of the series to BLG Uzi. I don't even remember him playing all that well when he did play, and so might be the first one that I've ever given out to him on this channel, but certainly is a funny little time period, I would say, for him overall. Looked really good in this series when he finally got on the Xayah, and this is what I really want to talk about when it comes to EDG. It feels like they haven't exactly found their footing in terms of the kind of comps that they want to play, the kind of games that they want to try and, you know, push their team forward with, and I think they finally started to find some success in terms of putting Uzi on a more early game, lane-focused AD carry, something that he can win early with, and then kind of rely on the rest of the team to be able to win in the late game. I think that has been something that this team has done relatively well, and honestly, it looked a ton better than just kind of putting Uzi on insert hyper carry, AD carry here, whether it be Zeri, whether it be Kai'Sa like it was in game number 1 here, or the Jinx, or the Aphelios, or whatever it's been over the course of this split. I like the Xayah a lot more for him and for this team playstyle-wise. I think it gives them more options, and honestly, Uzi is not meshed with this team in team fights yet, so take that responsibility off of him and give it to the rest of the team. But he looked fantastic in this series, really dominated the laning phase, was fantastic at being able to chunk out both Assume and Bao land towards the back half of the series to make a lot of aggressive plays more impossible. Obviously, that dive in the bot lane by Leon was not particularly good, but that was really set up by Uzi's consistent damage before that fight even ever took place, and so just good stuff overall. I think Mako really started to show himself again in this series. I'd been concerned with this bot lane. It felt like two very strong, dominant personalities, not necessarily meshing in the same kind of way that you would want out of them, but they made it work in this series. It'll be much more interesting when they go into maybe a more consistent bot lane, but at the very least, going into RA's bot lane, which hasn't been the worst in the entire league, it looked a lot better, especially in lane, and that's really what you want to see. Fofo and Jeje continue to be a really nice duo. Fofo is just a really, really good player. There really is not much else to say. His Lissandra in game 2 in particular was really good. He's just a very versatile player. He can play the Jace at a crazy high level, even if it wasn't great in game 1. He can play control mages. He can play more engage mages. He can play for team fights. He can play for lane. He can do whatever you really need him to do. And then Jeje had a much better series here than he had earlier on in the week. It's good to see him continue to try and unlock himself and mesh better with the team. I think playing around mid lane is just way more comfortable for him. We saw that throughout his entire career. In fact, I criticized him for it last year because I wanted him to play around Viper more and he was playing around Scout. But now I'm totally fine with him playing around Fofo and kind of letting Uzi just dominate in the 2v2 where I think he's going to be a lot stronger. Ale was fine, even if he was kind of the less remarkable top laner in the series, if I'm being honest. But in general, I think EDG looked good, and it's nice to see this team on a much more consistent basis than anything we really saw, kind of in the beginning of the split for them. And so for Rare Adam on the other side, I actually think they looked relatively good against a pretty decent team here. Obviously, EDG not exactly been the most consistent team, but you really held your own, I think, for a lot of this series. My dud of the series, unfortunately, is going to go to Leon in the jungle. Just a couple of miscoordinated dives, especially in the back half of this series, but the Kha'Zix game, the Sejuani game, not really going all that well for him. He is a very feast or famine player, as we all know for Rare Adam here, and unfortunately, it's been a lot of famine over the course of this split. I'm pretty out on Leon. I know there are a lot of people that are still pretty high on him, but I think at this point, my analysis has unfortunately rang true about him, and he's just not a player that I think is ever consistently going to be a positive for a team at the LPL level. He's just too up and down. And when you go against the best junglers in the league, they're going to be able to take advantage. I think there's too much tape of his downs now, and I think teams know how to play against it. But he was far from the only one. Baolan was fantastic on the Blitzcrank in game number 1, pairing up with Assume. That Draven Blitzcrank was a big reason why they were able to generate such a lead in that game 1, but he was pretty bad towards the back half of the series. I wanted to see way more coming out from Assume. He was miserable in that third and final game in particular, but really, if you're looking at positives, you're going to be looking at the top lane here, because Xiaoshu was really good in this series. That Cassante, man, that champion's so ridiculously broken. Showmaker obviously said it best, but, Xiaoshu piloted him at a very high level, and going into a good player in Ale, who, granted, hasn't exactly been at the top of his game across the beginning of the summer split, I still think I was really impressed with what I saw from him. Everybody's talking about Harry as this big next up-and-coming star top laner in the league. That's Xiaoshu to me. I really do believe that they're kind of on a different plane in terms of what they're going to be able to accomplish, and if Xiaoshu was like one of the top, 3 or 4 top laners in the league by the end of next year, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. Maybe it happens on Rare Adam, maybe it happens on another team, but man, he's got crazy upside, and I definitely think he was the best player on RA in this series. But Baolan was good in game number 1. Strive was pretty consistent across this whole series. There were good moments, and honestly, this team did keep up, especially in terms of trying things. Unfortunately, they just weren't the same level of skill as a team like EDG, and I think that got exploited here. But for EDG on the other side, it's a really nice win to have, and you're going to be really happy that you were able to pick it up here. I still want to see this team get more consistent against actual playoff teams, unlike Rare Adam, but at the very least, being able to pick up a win here, I think, is going to give them some level of confidence moving forward. And now we get into our final series of the week and our final series of day number 7 here, and it's the biggest upset of the week as well, as we saw Invictus Gaming taking on LNG Esports, and Invictus Gaming picks up not only a win, but a 2-0 win over LNG. This team's problems really kind of exploded in this series, and I'm definitely going to go on a rant. Some of the people who are used to the channel are used to rants on this channel, but I'm definitely going to go on one in this one, not because I hate any of these teams, but again, as per usual, because I hate the fans, and that's just what I do. But we'll talk about the game first and foremost so we can actually get to some analysis, because I want to talk about IG and how good they were, because that's certainly none of the conversation that's actually surrounding this game at all. You won't find a single comment on Invictus Gaming anywhere on social media after this win, even though they just 2-0'd LNG, because that's just kind of the world we live in, and so I want to be the one to hype them up. I want to be the one to talk about how good they were, because they really were fantastic in this series, and a lot of the things that I was really hoping to see from them consistency-wise happened in 2 straight games against one of the better teams in the league talent-wise, and so let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, player of the series for me was actually kind of a hotly contested trait, but I'm going to end up giving it to Cryan in the mid lane. He went deathless across both of these games, and man, he was really styling on him, especially on that Ahri in game number 2. Just a phenomenal series coming out from Cryan. This is somebody who I think I was pretty high on in terms of an addition coming into the split. I liked Cryan. I thought Dove was very overrated for this team, and I think Cryan was definitely an upgrade, and man, that has pretty much come to fruition. Now, he certainly hasn't been the most consistent mid laner in the entire league, but his highs are very high, and really, he's been a big catalyst for both of the wins that this team has been able to go under in terms of series across this season so far, and so Gotta give him a lot of credit for that. Really liked how he played in lane, but even out of lane, I thought he was just super explosive, moving around the map, playing with this jungler, creating numbers advantages for the team. Just good stuff coming in from the IG mid laner. And then the bot lane was also fantastic. On and Wink. Good to see On back in the lineup. This was the right choice, and man, it definitely paid off here. That Aphelios game in game 1 was terrific, but he was great on Draven in game number 2 as well. Just the more prioritized bot lane, I would say, out of these two teams, and definitely the one that I want to be a little bit, more positive about. On was fantastic in this series, and man, he just goes to show basically anytime he's given the opportunity why I think a lot of people consider him one of the more interesting ADC prospects in the region, more so than some of the other players, that I think a lot of people are hyping up right now. On, I think for a lot of people is that guy, and I still think he can be that guy. He's shown way more at this level than I think any of the other players in his kind of zone, and I think he could continue to grow into being one of the more interesting ADCs. Now, obviously the consistency has to really level up because he's just not been able to do that on a bad team, but ADC is one of those roles where if you are on a bad team, if every other lane is losing, if you have no jungle pressure, you're not really going to be able to do as much as you would on other teams. But I like On individually as a player, and Wink definitely stepped up. 2 Hook Champion games, not exactly what he's been killing it on over the course of this split, but still really good stuff. Tianjin was significantly more consistent. He's still so stubborn, and he's still bringing out the Rengar. Somebody on this team tell him to stop picking that. I don't know who's coaching them, but God, stop picking them Rengar. It is, I get it worked in this series, but this pick is garbage. This pick is trash, and I get it worked. People are going to look at it and say, he finally won a game, but God, it's just not good. It should not be getting picked, but, congratulations, he looked better in this series. You Should Know Me was definitely the better top laner in this series. This really was just a little bit of an everything gap for Invictus Gaming, and it's why when I start talking about LNG, I just have to be anti this. I'm just going to say this first and foremost to anybody out there. I don't think any people who would ever even think about doing this are watching my videos, especially an hour and 50 minutes in, but I gotta be honest when I talk about this. If you are the type of person to stand outside of a venue and wait for players to walk out after they have lost a game in order to shout profanities and slurs at them because they played poorly in a video game, I hope you get mental assistance. I hope that, obviously, because no sane person, no person who is well in the head would ever make that decision. And so I hope that you find yourself, you sit down and you go, I need help. I need to go talk to someone. I need to figure this out, because it's absurd that I even have to talk about this in the first place. But yes, Tarzan had a bad series. I absolutely agree. Does that make up for the fact that there were literally people waiting outside the arena for Tarzan to exit so that they could throw things and yell profanities at him? No, that's absurd. Like, are you kidding me right now? Like, that's one of the most disrespectful things I've ever seen. So all the people on Reddit that are cheering these fans that are doing this, you're the problem. Like, you are the issue. I don't usually get super serious on this channel, but God, that made me super mad. Like, it made me really, really real life upset, because God, I can't even imagine how you have to care so much in order for that to be the case. It is absurd. But yeah, Tarzan's not had a great start to the split. He's going to get done of the series. But man, this was an everything gap. This wasn't entirely Tarzan's fault. Can Tarzan start playing better? Yeah, he absolutely can. And he's been prone to hot and cold streaks, but he was really good in spring. And now, of course, go on Reddit, you're going to see people that are saying, oh, he actually wasn't all that good in spring because recency bias and everybody likes to rewrite history. No, he was the best jungler in the league, maybe outside of Jeje, in spring. And even then, I think you could make the argument that he was the best jungler in spring. He just didn't get the job done in playoffs, and it's going to happen every once in a while. But yes, he started out cold, and hopefully he can pick it up, but it's just, God, it frustrates me so much to see so much, like, negativity and hatred thrown at these players just for them going out there and doing their job. It's actually absurd. But with that aside, again, rant aside, the rest of this team wasn't very good either. I think everybody else was very underperforming. Gala and Hang, while they were isolated a lot of this series and didn't really get a lot of attention, were at a numbers disadvantage. Gala still hasn't been that guy that's been able to step up and win 2v2 in the same kind of way that I think a lot of us wanted to. Of course, maybe if he gets a little bit more assistance, he's going to be able to, but Scout was gapped in this series. This was one of the worst ones he's had all split long, and, Cryan's a good player, but Scout should not be getting gapped by Cryan. Zika was absolutely destroyed in the top lane by You Should Know Me. This wasn't exactly one player losing the series for LNG, and for all those people who are saying if they replace jungle, LNG would all of a sudden become a top team, it's delusional. Again, it's naive. It's this idea that, oh, I can pinpoint the problem. you can't pinpoint the problem. You don't know what's going on in these comms, and clearly there's something going on because we know these players can perform at a higher level. To blame it all on one person is just absurd. It's the same thing that happened to Karsa. It's never one person's fault when a team doesn't have a successful situation like this. You've got to be able to look at it from a grander picture, a bigger picture, and LNG is going to need to start doing that. These problems are never as black and white as everybody on the internet likes to make them out to be. These are complex problems, and I hope LNG is going to be able to figure them out, but they're not really looking nearly as consistent as they need to right now, and I understand the frustration with how they've been playing, but taking it out on these players in real life, that is just a step too far. But again, what I want to do is congratulate Invictus Gaming, because there's not a single comment about them on any of the post-match threads. It's all, calling Tarzan the worst player of all time and talking about LNG is never going to win. How about we praise Invictus Gaming for being able to take down LNG? They still had to step up, and they did. This was almost every single player's best series of the year on this team, and I really want to give them a lot of credit for that. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 4 overview and analysis video. I really do appreciate you guys sticking around to the end if you did. This is almost a 2-hour-long video, so I really do appreciate you guys' patience. But up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LPL standings after week number 4. Of course, numbers 1 to 17, playoff teams top 10 at the current moment. Going to be listed on the left-hand side. Bottom 7 will be listed on the right-hand side. But let's go ahead and get into the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power ranking number. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. We can go over kind of where everything is, some of the changes, not any crazy changes this week. I feel like everything is pretty settled in terms of what the LPL is at the current moment, but JDG and BLG obviously sticking at the top, but we actually have some movement in the top 4 for the first time in a while. Top Esports and Weibo Gaming going to jump up to numbers 3 and 4. Those are world spots for me, respectively, because LNG simply has to fall down to number 5. I have to criticize them for the week that they had. The consistency that they have just puts them outside of the top 4 right now. Honestly, you could make the case that they're number 6 behind OMG, but for now, I'm going to keep them right outside at number 5 because I trust that they're going to be able to figure it out more so than maybe some other people, but they're really right on the edge. If I continue to lower them, I'm not going to be all that surprised, but RNG jumping up to number 7 from number 9. They look like the best of that next group of teams, and then, slotting down, EDG falls to 8, and then, of course, WE falls to 9 after a pretty rough week, if I'm being entirely honest for them. NIP stays at 10 because, again, there just aren't a lot of teams in the bottom half that are going to be taking their spots, even if they don't look all that good right now. But then couple of changes in bottom 7. Ultra Prime ends up skipping Rare Atom after beating them. They still don't look great, but they looked better than Rare Atom because they were able to beat them. And then FPX leapfrogging IG again because they were able to beat them, going from 14 to 15. But ThunderTalk staying at 13. AL staying at 16 and LGD staying at 17. I know LGD beat AL this week, and some people are going to see that and be like, how is that even possible? But man, I just trust AL in a series more than I trust LGD. I don't trust either of these teams at all. If you want to put AL at 17, if you want to put LGD at 16, whatever. I don't really think it makes all that much of a difference, but I'm more scared of Xiao Hao than Meteor, and that's really what it comes down to. And so AL stays at number 16 and LGD stays at number 17. But those are the risers and fallers. It's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 4 in the LPL. And man, people are going to be excited about this one because player of the week for me, and I never thought I'd say this, in week 4 of the LPL is going to go to Zhao Laohu, the top laner for FPX. He was really fantastic this week and someone that I definitely want to point out for just being an overall, positive for the team. I didn't exactly trust him going into the year and hasn't exactly shown much, but this was the super week for him. This was the week where he finally showed himself as a top laner that can actually be taken seriously. And honestly, for me, he was the most interesting player of the week. And so Zhao Laohu is going to get my player of the week here in week number 4. And my dud of the week, pretty obviously, is going to go to Forge, the mid laner of Ultra Prime. I mean, he was miserable across the 2 final series. I get that he was pretty good in their first series of the week, or at least survivable, serviceable, I should say. But man, he was so not serviceable in the final 2 series of the week that those were more than enough to be able to grab him dud of the week. Definitely a few contenders for that this week. Hang from WE, definitely in that conversation as well. But for me, my dud of the week in week 4 is going to go to Forge, and my player of the week is going to go to Zhao Laohu. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We cover the LPL every single week on this channel, and not only do we cover the LPL, we cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL weekly on this channel. So if you want comprehensive LoL esports coverage of basically every league, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. and I will see you all later.